opening statement. Good morning, both.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair, and thanks to the committee for the opportunity to appear before you this morning. And we're pleased to be here once again. With the laying of our annual report and accounts for the year to 31st March 25 before Parliament in October, we welcome particularly the opportunity to discuss any aspect of these documents. And we're happy to report continued positive progress at Revenue Scotland. And there are a number of highlights I'd just like to mention in advance. This year marks a significant milestone, Revenue Scotland's 10th anniversary. And over the past decade, we've grown from a newly established body into a more mature, resilient and forward-looking organisation. To recognise this achievement, we were honoured to attend the Scottish Parliament a few weeks ago, and thank you, Chair, for agreeing to be our host at that event, where we engaged with MSPs to reflect on our journey and share our vision for the future. Throughout the year, we've held a series of events with staff, stakeholders and partners to set out our progress and reaffirm our commitment to delivering excellence in tax administration for the people of Scotland. Now, as an organisation, we're committed to be as efficient and effective as we can be. We continue to operate with a strong focus on automation, technology and maintaining a digital-first mindset. Now, this is a fundamental pillar for our organisation, and in this last year, we've made additional investment in the skilled resources that will help to deliver on our digital data and technology strategy, ensuring that we drive additional value through what is a critical area for the benefit of all of our stakeholders. We've also actively contributed to the development of Scotland's tax strategy, engaging directly with Scottish Government colleagues through roundtable and bilateral discussions on the future shape of devolved taxes in Scotland. Now, clearly, this has to be achieved against a backdrop of significant public sector reform, and by ensuring that we invest correctly and wisely over the next few years, we will be able to contribute fully across a number of the areas set out in the recent PSR strategy published by Scottish Government. We want to be an exemplar in our ability to collaborate, to use shared service models, and to share our ideas and deliverables to help make us all more efficient. And as we look ahead to the design and delivery of existing and new devolved taxes, we're looking to ensure that our future operating model aligns to that public service reform agenda. Now, if you look at our corporate plan for 2024 to 27, we continue to make strong progress, and it remains our strategic focus over the coming years. Our annual business plan supports delivery across all 4 outcomes mentioned in that plan, and I'd like to highlight again a few areas where we're already seeing meaningful progress. Now, I've already mentioned our digital data and technology strategy, which is embedded in the corporate plan, and to support this, we've continued to enhance our digital and data capabilities, ensuring customer needs are at the forefront. We've invested not just in our core digital systems, we've improved our website and guidance materials, and we've embraced new developments in the IT space. Now, over the next few years, there will be additional tax responsibilities for new taxes. The first of these, Scottish Aggregates Tax, will be launching next April, and we've worked closely with Scottish Government and industry stakeholders to ensure an effective implementation, with successful internal testing of our SETS platform, which is effectively the systems that we operate, and further taxpayer engagement is planned. And it's a great example, I think, of close collaboration, a technology-first approach, and great project management to date, that we're on track. There will be other devolved taxes that are either in train or being considered, for example, the Scottish Building Safety Levy and Air Departure Tax. And again, we're working closely with Scottish Government, sharing our insights and expertise, and we'll be ready to adapt our systems to be able to implement or support the implementation of such taxes efficiently and effectively. Now, we continue to make progress in creating a supportive, inclusive and high-performing workforce and workplace. Our EDI strategy and action plan are aligned with our corporate plan and people strategy. Through the Futures project, we've successfully implemented a dynamic hybrid working model that enhances operational efficiency and support staff well-being. This has allowed us to use physical office space much more efficiently and to recruit skilled personnel more widely than the central belt of Scotland. And we base this working model on both external and internal evidence on what works best and continue to refine our approach here. In 2024-25, our People Survey results placed us among the top 7 civil service organisations in the UK across all themes, achieving our goal of ranking within the top 25% across the UK. Revenue Scotland benefits from an excellent board with a diverse range of skills and experience, and I'd like to publicly thank our board members for their invaluable contributions and their support for me as chair. We recently welcomed 2 new members, further enhancing the diversity and expertise at board level, and we've also taken on board 3 co-optees to our 2 committees, again giving us greater expertise in areas that will be really important going forward. I would also like to record the board's heartfelt thanks to Elaine Lorimer, who has decided to step down after nearly a decade of distinguished service. Her vision, integrity and unwavering commitment have shaped the organisation from its earliest days. She leaves behind a legacy of excellence, resilience and innovation. And on behalf of the board and all of us at Revenue Scotland, I extend our deepest appreciation and warmest wishes to Elaine as she embarks on her next chapter. And her leadership will continue to inspire us as we move forward. Now, following a rigorous recruitment process where we had a lot of applications, we are pleased to welcome Johanna Boyd as our new CEO. Johanna brings a wealth of experience and a proven track record in executive leadership, and I'm confident that under her guidance, Revenue Scotland will continue to thrive and deliver for Scotland. And finally, in the context of continuous change, which we're all going through, we should note that Revenue Scotland collected £962 million in revenues for the year to 31st March 2025, while keeping our costs below 1% of revenues collected, which has been an important benchmark for us up to this point. And we look forward to continuing to improve on our overall performance, be seen as a real asset, as an efficient public service, and we stand ready to take on more challenges going forward. So thank you once again to the committee for the opportunity to engage with you today, and I very much look forward to our discussions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Aidan. Thanks for that opening statement and also for the reports, actually, which we've been given a thorough read-through. I have to say, very positive. But, of course, there's always 1 or 2 wee things that I'll be asking you about as well, colleagues around the table. I mean, the first one, I'll just touch on the fact that the revenue expenditure, you know, it's £8,694,000, which is £406,000 less than your budget. So that's really very significant in terms of what the Scottish Government's trying to do in terms of its own targets for efficiency. And I'm just wondering whether or not it's likely that that kind of downward trend will continue.
I'll do that, Aidan. So, yes, thank you for noticing, Chair, that we had made savings in our budget last year, but there was reasons for that. Part of it was to do with the introduction of the new Oracle system, which we report on within our accounts, which is the HR system, finance processing system that Scottish Government introduced last year and we benefit from by way of a shared service. As part of the handover for Oracle, we had to freeze the filling of any vacancies to allow for secure data transfer, etc. So that meant over the course of last year we weren't able to fill, we were holding vacancies for a number of months. Which is why when you go into this year, when we come back next year to talk about our performance, you will see that our headcount has gone up again because we were holding vacancies. But what we also managed to do last year was really screw down on the little discretionary spend that we have. We were conscious that Scottish Government were looking to a path to balance. There was an ask out to all public bodies to see what savings could be made in that year, and Revenue Scotland contributed to that. So we went round every area of discretionary spend that we had and made as many savings as we could. And we've done the same again this year. For the same reasons, although this year, because our recruitment profile has been more active, we've managed to fill our vacancies faster than last year. We won't be able to offer up the same savings this year as we did last year. So savings And operating efficiently as an organisation is absolutely the heart of what we do. So when we are discussing what budget requirements we need from Scottish Government, from Scottish ministers, we're always looking at how we can keep our costs down as much as we can. And that plays out, as you'll see, in terms of the costs that we're asking for the introduction of aggregates tax and building safety levy. The approach we've taken there is very similar.
Yes, I know you're always keen to try and keep the amount, the cost of Revenue Scotland to below 1%, and that will be a bit of a challenge with the bill that we're going to be debating and discussing soon. I won't go into that at the moment, but staff absences are an issue, though, it appears, in terms of the kind of... I noticed that you went from an average of 8.6 working days lost in 23-24 to 10.7 in 24-25, which is a jump. I mean, that means that your staff on average are off more than 2 weeks each.
So
year, which is quite a lot, I think.
Yes, of course. The cause of that, with being a relatively small organisation, stats around things like staff averages and absences, are overemphasised, if you like, because of their size. It skews our stats, figures, yes, and that particular one was in relation to, we had 2 members of staff who were off long-term sick. I'm pleased to say that we were able to, through the approach that we take to supporting our staff when they're off, we were able to enable one of those members of staff to return to work. The other member of staff, unfortunately, has had to leave. But yes, our approach on sickness absences is very forensic, so we get quarterly statistics through. We look at those as an executive team. We know at team level, obviously, what the situation is, and we have a whole process of supporting our people when they are off to try and encourage them to come back fit and well to be able to continue to contribute to our performance.
Okay, and in his opening statement, Aidan talked a lot about digital issues and the need to invest more in digital services, etc. And there's a whole list of different programmes that you are investing in. I'm just wondering what work has been done to ensure interoperability with existing Scottish Government digital platforms.
Yes, so starting from the shared services that we rely on, so all of our systems sit on SCOTS. For our core operating systems within Revenue Scotland. So that is a shared service. So that obviously is core to our operations. The rest of our digital investment has been primarily around our electronic tax system. And in terms of interoperability, we're really interested in making sure that that system is capable of being added to on a modular basis for new taxes, for example. We have to have barriers around it, if you like, ring fences around it because of the taxpayer information that sits on it. So rather than the system being interoperable, what is important to us is that we have access to data to enable us to share data with other organisations rather than creating new data sets for us where that data set exists somewhere else. So our system that we have, it meets all the Scottish Government requirements in terms of security, in terms of the platform that it's on, etc. But also importantly for us, in terms of future interoperability, it's going to be more about can we get the data access to be able to share the data that we are able to share as a tax authority with other public bodies, and likewise have pipelines, if I call it pipes of data to come back into our organisation so that we are able to maximise the benefit of the data that's available across the public service in Scotland to enable us to do our job without having to create new sets of data just for us. I hope that makes sense to you.
Yes, it does. I'm not going to go down the rabbit hole of asking a lot more questions on this particular area because of time constraints and other issues I want to touch on, but that is itself informative. Now, in terms of issues arising from last year's evidence session, we talked about user satisfaction being 76%, and Elaine, you said that's good, but it's not good enough. So where are we now in terms of user satisfaction?
Thank you. So yes, this relates to the KPI that we set ourselves, which is a recognised benchmark across 13 sectors of different types of business across the UK. I was asking just about this yesterday because I thought you might ask me about it. And the benchmark across the 13 sectors this year is up at 77%. Now, what we measure to look at compliance against that benchmark is feedback on our digital system. So it's feedback on SETS, on our electronic tax system, which we get directly from agents, and feedback on our website. And on a monthly basis, we have over 200 elements of feedback that come back via our website. On our electronic tax system, it's around 20 to 30. And what I'm being advised is that our information so far is positive against that 77% benchmark. Of course, that benchmark is only looking at so much. We also look at our performance against other things, which are statutory requirements, such as our performance against answering freedom of information requests timorously, and you'll see from our report we have done that in every instance, bar one. We look at our other KPIs that we set ourselves around how quickly we answer phones, how quickly we respond to correspondence, and you'll see within our report that we've more than exceeded those KPIs. So that particular benchmark is looking at responses to the services that we provide digitally. And yes, this year we are already ahead of that.
You know, being the kind of benchmark, and 76% last year. So where would you be, do you think, roughly now?
Well, we don't. I'm afraid I can't give you that information at this point in the year because it's something.
Answer, isn't it? You know?
Because it's something that we look at and we reflect on at the end of the year. But as of mid-year point,
yes,
we're there.
I think it would be fair to say also that the board is also looking at other ways of engagement in order to get greater feedback as well, to get further assurance that not only are we heading in the right direction, but that we're staying at a high level of efficiency and acceptance as well, as far as our key stakeholders are concerned. So we are continuing to take on more feedback and more avenues and streams of feedback, and I think that will help to establish more in terms of the evidence that we've got to say that we are on the right track of continuing to improve the feedback that we're getting.
Okay, thank you. Now, in terms of your corporate governance report, it's been pointed out by the DIA that the culture within Revenue Scotland continues to be open to audit and assurance. However, they said that as part of the 23-24 audit, two matters were highlighted for attention, namely the risks that related party disclosure may be incomplete or inaccurate, and the scope for medium-term financial planning arrangements need to be developed further to highlight and ensure financial sustainability, and action to address these matters is underway and expected to be complete. So I just wonder if you can touch on that for a wee minute.
Yes, so this audit recommendation from Audit Scotland, I think, was around our medium-term financial planning, and it is not, as we've said in the report, it's not that we don't do financial planning, we do, but what they're asking us to do is go deeper in terms of stress testing it against different scenarios. So that is the work that we were taking forward this year. So when we put in our budget bid into Scottish Government, you know, that is not just on a one-year basis, that's currently on a 3 to 5 year basis, and we run a load of scenarios around that. What Audit Scotland are looking for us to do is to set that out in a document that we can take to the board and we can stress test. So that is the work that's undergoing this year.
Okay, thanks very much. And in terms of the assurances provided by the accountable officer, I understand that these raised some issues in respect to financial controls within the organisation. Some additional matters were identified internally to backlogs of work within the finance function.
Yes. So we had a situation in this last year with our finance team. We had some very experienced, a very small team. There's only 4 people within it. And we had a number of staff left over the course of the year and took with them their knowledge and experience. That gave rise to some backlogs which we'd identified, but Audit Scotland, when they came in, were very thorough and found more issues in relation to backlogs and not conforming with some of the processes that we'd set out. So what we did was we took immediate action. As accountable officer, I set up a steering group to oversee delivery against the actions that they had asked us to do. It was a fantastic example of Revenue Scotland standing up to respond. And so what we were able to do was deal with all the backlogs, get an internal audit in to provide assurance that there were no matters which were untoward. It was simply created by staff churn, staff turnover and processes not being followed timeously that should have been. We got all of that back on track in time for the full audit. The audit stuck to the original timetable. And I'm pleased to say that we have, over the course of the summer, we've also recruited a really experienced new head of finance, new finance team, and they are continuing to adhere to the timescales that we set ourselves in terms of those processes. What we've also done is, as part of the internal audit work that I asked to be done, I asked them to look forward as well in terms of what are the further opportunities for us to enhance our finance team and the processes that we undertake there, because there are a lot of handoffs between our finance team and our tax operations team, and some of the processes are terribly manual, and there's the opportunity in due course for us to automate some of those. So they've given us some recommendations around that, and we've got a project now going on within Revenue Scotland to take that forward. So in due course, I expect that some of those processes, which, as I say, are very manual, it's reconciliations, for example, we will be able to automate.
And this was an area where the board, and as you would expect, the Audit and Risk Committee in particular, took keen interest. And again, I think it was an example of where everything was stepped up to ensure that we take the learnings from this as well, in terms of that is a vulnerability of a small organisation if we have a small finance function. And so it's trying to embed a greater skill set that we would be able to identify any issues earlier, etc., and deal with them.
Yeah, more flexible future. I mean, I have to say that the Scottish Government's Director of Internal Audit and Assurance did say that no fraud or losses of tax revenues were identified through this process, which obviously is very important. Just one last question for me, and it's in terms of Statement of Revenue and Expenditure. I noticed that in terms of penalties and interest, there was quite a significant increase from 2.178 million in terms of penalties to 5.58 million in penalties, so more than doubled. And if you add the interest to that, it's about a 3.7 million increase on the year. So I'm just wondering, explain what the reason for that was.
Yes, indeed. This is the issue of issuing penalties. We had, if we look back at previous years, you'll see that there was a lull, well, not quite a lull, but there was a drop in the amount of penalties that we were issuing. That was a product of, can I call it, the COVID period, where as part of our response to support businesses was to pause on issuing penalties when they were going through significant challenges over that period. So essentially what we've done is we've caught up with the penalties that were due to be issued over those earlier years. The vast majority of those penalties are in relation to lease reviews, and we've spoken to the committee before about the challenges we face as a tax authority with this lease review policy, whereby every 3 years, if you are a leaseholder of a commercial lease, you should be submitting a fresh tax return to Revenue Scotland. And we are finding that a very challenging area of policy to get above 50% of compliance. So we're finding that we are issuing a lot of lease review penalties. They are by far the majority of the penalties that we're issuing. So essentially it was catching up on the backlog created over the COVID years, and the focus being on those lease review penalties. The last thing I should also say is within our report, you'll see we do talk about areas where we have introduced some automation, and the issuing of penalty letters is one area where we have been able to automate some of that process. So we've also obviously become more efficient, so we're issuing more. So that's the cause of it, I'm afraid.
Thank you very much. I think I've hogged enough of your time just now, and colleagues are keen to come in. So it's Michelle, to be followed by John.
Good morning. Thank you very much for joining us. And can I just say, first of all, thank you for all your hard work in Revenue Scotland. And I think you've created a culture that will influence and shape the organisation going forward, which is very important. I know last year I asked about the representation and the split between men and women, and I can see you've made determined attempts. I was heartened to hear about your new CEO, and also I can see the 2 new board members. But we've still got a way to go in terms of the board and both the audit and risk committee as well. They're at 37% and 20% women representation on them respectively. So, and I can see you've co-opted as well, because obviously board positions are a fixed term. But I just wanted to get a sense of, and it may be yourself, Aidan, where you are in this journey to get to the target, and indeed what is your target?
Yeah, so thank you for the question, and it's an area that is close to my heart, as you know, in terms of trying to ensure that we get the best diversity that we possibly can at board level. And I would say that this year marks a year of really good progress in terms of not just the board appointments, but also the mix that we've got on co-optees in terms of the diversity and skill set there. And inevitably, this is still going to take time based on when there are future retirals. But I see this as an opportunity again next year as we start the process of 2 board members, and ultimately at the end of next year we'll start the process about replacing myself as well, that we adopt the same strategy that we adopted this year, which was reaching out as far as possible to as many groups as an attraction strategy, and to deliver the message that we really are serious about improving the diversity, not just the gender diversity, but the overall diversity of the board. And I think it was represented in the different types of applicants that we had this year to the non-exec positions, as well as to the chief executive position. It was actually quite heartening that we had a much broader mix of applications coming in.
That you're also focusing, or part of your mix is cognitive diversity as well.
Yes.
Okay. So that's good, and I'll watch with interest. In terms of the gender pay gap, women on average are earning 5.9% less than men, but that's increased from 1.9% since the last reporting. And again, I appreciate the scale of the organisation can mean that can quite quickly become skewed, particularly with senior appointments. But it would be useful to hear some reflections on why that is the case, because obviously it's going in the wrong direction.
Yes, and again, so there's a couple of points maybe to make about that. First of all, that is measured at a particular point in time. So it just depends how your organisation is sitting at that point in time. So it's 31st of March. But and in a small organisation it can get skewed. But when you look at the representation across the grades, we are doing well in terms of making sure, as far as we can, that we have gender diversity across the grades and equality. Because obviously, in terms of pay, everybody gets paid the same rate, irrespective of gender. So it's a question of where are the women sitting within the grades within the organisation. And what's been pleasing to see this last year is a number of promotions within the organisation where women have been getting promoted from the lower grades up. So again, a bit like Aidan, it's just a matter of time. Some of our more senior grades, at senior leadership team, if you include myself in that, there's 4 of us where we're 50-50. The grade below that, we're almost there at 50-50. So as you go down through the organisation, we are making progress. That percentage was just because it was taken at that point in the year.
Okay, I'll carry on just now. I wanted to ask what assessment you had made from a risk perspective, and particularly a corporate risk perspective, to the Supreme Court judgment earlier this year. What's happened with many organisations is they've still left it in HR, when really it has the potential, or it must be assessed as a corporate risk, given the potential for litigation. So what's your approach been?
I'll take that, Aidan. So I'll take it initially. So this has been discussed at our Staffing and Equalities Committee of the board. We haven't raised it to being on our corporate risk register in itself. Instead, what we have done is we have decided that we have to walk very carefully through the impact of the judgment on our policies. Of course, so much of our policies are policies of Scottish Government. So, because
itself, given the slowness, I mean, that's a critical risk. Now, somebody could still take litigation against you, and it's no defence in law to say we're waiting for the Scottish Government.
Yes, and we're aware of that, and our Staffing and Equalities Committee have made that very clear to us, because our chair of our Staffing and Equalities Committee sits in the Employment Tribunal.
Ah, right.
So we are doing what we can. I think the main thing for us is, if we think about it practically, and then I'll come on to it culturally. If we think about it practically, we sit within a Scottish Government building in Victoria Quay, where it's over to Scottish Government to make sure that the facilities there are commensurate with the judgment. In terms of things like the toilet facilities, there are gender-neutral toilets, and there are female and male toilets. When you come back to our organisation, I think what's really important is that we treat everyone in our organisation respectfully. We have a fantastic reputation for being an inclusive employer, and everybody is welcome. And that is the message we've been sending out within Revenue Scotland. Our specific policies around where we're located, what we have there in terms of facilities for people. We are engaging with Scottish Government to make sure that those policies are commensurate with the impact of the judgment.
Okay.
And I think we take regular feedback from focus groups within the organisation as well, to make sure that our finger is very firmly on the pulse of the organisation in terms of how it's feeling about the policies and how we're doing. And just to re-emphasise, the experience we've got on the Staff and Equalities Committee is very, very focused on that, not just looking at our workforce planning, but in terms of the practical implementation of those policies. So not only are we very aware, but we're keeping our finger very much on the pulse so that we can be rapidly reactive if there is an issue.
And then there are a number of us on the Scottish, there's a Scottish Government Delivery Bodies group, which consists of organisations, primarily organisations who are separate employers, but on the SG main, if I can call it that, terms and conditions. So all staff are civil servants. And so as a collective, that we have been staying connected, because what we're really conscious of is that we need to kind of stand together in our approach, because what would not be right would be for one organisation to head off in a particular direction, which could open up concerns in terms of litigation for the rest of us. So we're trying to move forward carefully, mindful of the guidance that's come out from the Equalities Commission, but also we need to make sure that we're in lockstep with what the Scottish Government are also publishing by way of policy change.
I think taking a risk-based approach will be very wise for all the areas you've outlined. Just a last wee question, because I raised this last year, going back to the convener's questions about digitisation. I asked you last year about your thinking on AI. We're a year down the line, and I mean, I've heard of some public sector organisations who've said that, you know, their staff shouldn't use AI at all, which seems somewhat Luddite. But I just wanted to get a sense of where you were at. I mean, a lot of people are using Copilot or Gemini or ChatGPT or wherever routinely, but where's your thinking on this year?
So on AI, there's essentially, if I can talk about two elements. So there's one of which I've already mentioned, which is around the use of automation for our processes. And that's an area where we have made progress this year in terms of some of our batch correspondence. We can generate automatically now off our system as a result of investment that we've made into our system, and that will free up staff time to do other work. We are also one of the organisations within the Scottish Government's remit that have taken on Copilot. We are very mindful of the risks associated with that, because of course the key thing for us is understanding where information goes from a security perspective. So what we've done is we've got a small number of staff within Revenue Scotland who have got the full co-pilot licence, and they are trialling that in safe areas. That is being overseen. We've got an information governance group within Revenue Scotland that supports our CIRO, our Senior Information Responsible Owner, around the sort of corporate decisions we'll need to make about using that sort of software more regularly around our organisation. The feedback so far is that Copilot is pretty good for the things that we are using it for. So it's things like minutes of meetings, notes of meetings, whether we could introduce it more broadly into some of our interactions with taxpayers and things like that. We need to just walk through that very carefully. We also had a presentation at the board. Was that what you're going to mention?
And again, keeping abreast of the developments in wider Scottish Government, we've already engaged and had updates in terms of where AI could potentially be deployed. And as such, we've baked in to our future digital data and technology strategy the increasing use and the usability of AI-driven automation. One of the caveats that I always put in this is it will very much depend on the quality of data that we're able to extract from the systems. So it is as important that we not just only improve the data sets that we're getting, because that will then lead to the increasing opportunity for that data to be interrogated intelligently by AI. And we see that as a big plus in the future. But it's not just our data sets, it's other departments' data sets that we could interact with, which will really bring the bigger prize for everybody.
Thank you. Thank you,
To be followed by Craig.
Thanks so much, Convener. I noticed that your staff costs have gone up somewhat, and well, some of the particular figures, increase in staff from 94 to 99, although increase in permanent contracted staff from 88 to 96. Wages up from 4.1 million to 4.6 million, staff costs up from 5.8 million to 6.5 million. So I just wonder if you could comment on that.
Yes, that's right. So our headcount has increased as per our workforce plan for the year. We needed to bring some new staff into our organisation to support the introduction of aggregates tax and the preparatory work for building safety levy. And we've also invested this year in our, as Aidan mentioned, in our digital and data team. And in order to be able to accommodate these changes to our staffing complement, what we've done is not filled other vacancies as they've arisen elsewhere in the organisation. So we are taking a strategic approach to how we invest in the capability that we need to have as an organisation. So that has obviously had an impact on our costs. But the costs, when you break them down, a significant element of that is in relation to pay rises, which we obviously have to adhere to. We're part of Scottish Government main terms and conditions. So whatever this...
over 3 years.
Sorry?
The government's target of 9% over 3 years.
Yes, but it's not 3% each year. So it's what's been negotiated by Scottish Government. So it was front loaded. So yes, so that's in there as well. So it's a mixture of our headcount going up slightly and the impact of salaries. On the agency staff, so that was to assist us, the convener mentioned our long-term absences there. We had some real pinch points in the two teams that were impacted by that, and we brought in some short-term agency staff to support us who've now left. And
on page 84 it talks about the pension benefits of the senior leadership team.
Yes.
They appear to have gone up quite a lot.
I'm afraid that's a product of the scheme.
You can't help ageing.
That's just a product of the scheme. We have no influence on that at all.
Yeah, no, I thought that might be the case. So the overall picture I mean, this target you've got, as the convener mentioned, of the 1% of your total revenues would be in admin. So that went up from 0.87 the previous year to 0.93 this year. Now, I take your point that you're preparing for new taxes. And as the convener also said, we'll discuss the particular building levy next time. But, I mean, the building levy is quite small. So is it liable to push you over the 1%?
So the two taxes that we have coming our way, aggregates tax and Scottish Building Safety Levy, we are very mindful of the revenues that are being forecast for those taxes and the impact that that will have on that 1% figure. So if we set up costs to one side and look at our running costs each year that we'll be doing these taxes, the 1% will be put under pressure because the revenues are not as high as we would like. Now, of course, these are forecasts. It will depend very much of what happens when we take them on and what we see when we're starting to work those taxes, what we see in terms of compliance or non-compliance. What I can assure the committee around, though, is we have that 1% firmly in our sights when we are working hard to work out what the additional costs are for our organisation to take these on. So a good example is aggregates, where our previous model may have been to set up an individual aggregates tax team within our organisation and staff it up the way we staff up our other taxes. Because of our concern about running costs, what we have done is taken account of the decline in landfill tax revenues, and we have instead put together a joint team, which we're calling Environmental Taxes Team. So the aggregates tax will be administered and managed by a joint team, which allows us to not have to increase the headcount as much as we may have done in the past. Building Safety Levy, because it's a brand new tax, there isn't an equivalent, a direct equivalent that we're getting from anywhere else.
Convener wants to keep that to
I know, but
later,
the story is slightly different there.
Fair enough. Because presumably with like landfill tax, although the revenue's falling, you've still got much the same admin cost for it, I take it.
Well, indeed, the admin cost might go up marginally as the behaviour of that industry moves towards the declining of those landfill tax. So it may require that we need to do additional compliance activity around there as the revenues decline. So it's not always a linear model that we'll be looking at.
Okay.
That's right, and the nature of the work in that team is changing, as Aidan has said.
So going back to your staff and so on, I note your bit about the hybrid operating model, and maybe you could tell us about that, because from my reading of it, it's saying that staff have flexibility, but they have to be in for key business activities, including New Start induction, board, committee meetings, that kind of thing. So can the staff work entirely at home unless they've got a special meeting to go to, or is that not what it is?
It's open to the staff to work at home, provided there isn't a business need for them to be in the office. And the range of activities which we class as anchor activities for the office is wider than what you've just said. So, for example, team meetings take place in the office. If there are particular projects that staff are working on where it would be to the benefit of the outcome of that project that they come into the office, So I was in the office yesterday and there was a group of staff in because there was a particular project that they wanted to get their heads around and get some action on, so they recognised that was something they needed to come into the office for. So we have a sort of bare minimum, if you like. But yes, if outside of that, if staff are as productive working from home as being in the office, they are able to work from home.
Because I think some organisations have moved away a bit from home working and insisting people are in 2 days a week, 3 days a week, something like that. So you don't have that kind of rule. We haven't
moved to that model, that direct model of insisting you're in the office set days in the week, because that wouldn't necessarily produce for us the performance that we have enjoyed over recent years. Apart from anything else, if I insisted that staff were in the office set days in the week, our office wouldn't be big enough, because as part of our hybrid operating model, we were able to reduce our footprint within Victoria Quay. So no, we deliberately chose not to go down that route, because all the evidence told us that the way to go was to look not at anchored days in the office, activities in the office, and that allows our staff to come into the office for the things that require optimum performance to be done at the office, and then they have the flexibility to work from home. I have to say we also have staff, of course, who would rather be in the office more, and they can be in the office more, and indeed they are.
And I would just re-emphasise that we do keep a close eye on this.
Yes.
And just look at the behavioural patterns, but also we're very much focused on the outputs as opposed to the inputs in terms of the productivity. And that's where very much we see productivity has actually improved since COVID over the period. And as an attraction strategy, and we think there is definitely a connection between very much the high staff satisfaction scores with the model that we're operating. And as long as productivity remains high, then we're content to keep taking evidence on this model and sharing that evidence more widely as a model which certainly the board believes in at the moment.
Right. Okay, so to some extent it's still under review, it's ongoing. Because, I mean, my own personal experience, which is reasonably limited, I mean, some staff I completely would trust at home, and they'll probably work, as you say, better than they do in the office. But some staff don't, frankly.
Yes.
But
Well, can I come in?
Yeah.
So, because I think, we know what our staff are doing. If we think about it, most of our work is done electronically now. So we absolutely know what our staff are doing and what output they are providing. We can see it. So I would, with respect, push back on your assertion. I think there will always be, at the margins, there will always be some people who, and we would have that anyway, whether you were in the office or not, there will always be a small number of people who are not performing the way that you would like them to perform. When we're in that situation with our staff, with our hybrid model, those staff are in the office. We bring them back into the office. But I would not want to change our model because of a small number of people at the margins, because the benefits for us of what we have at the moment is fantastic recruitment. The people we are bringing into our organisation are talking about our hybrid model as one of the attractions for them. We're able to recruit people, as we've said, I think, in our report, from all over Scotland now, who still recognise they have to come into Victoria Quay for those anchor activities in the office. So, but it has broadened our reach as an employer, and I think that can only be a good thing.
okay, well, somebody else might be here next year asking you the same question, but it won't be me. And my final point, cyber security. I mean, I see you've got a list in your report of 13 risks. Number 11 is cyber security. That seems, I don't know if they're in order, but that seems quite low down. They're not in order. Okay, well, that's perhaps reassuring. You're reasonably relaxed about it?
No.
The board is never relaxed in cyber security, and you may know that one of the co-optees that we've got into the Audit and Risk Committee is a cyber security specialist. That's what he does for a living, and it's an area that keeps us all awake at night, not just relying on what's happening more broadly at Scottish Government level, but also ensuring that our connection with outside external stakeholders, which is a key risk, so particularly working with NEC on the SET system, that we need to always get key assurance that they're staying completely up to date on their firewalls, on the way in which they would handle a potential penetration attack. So it's something that actually remains very high up on the list, particularly Audit and Risk Committee level, as a key risk that we have to monitor on a regular basis, and indeed question whether the things that we need to do in particular that go further than Cybersecurity Essentials Plus, which is where the benchmark is currently at ScotGov level, and we keep that constantly under review.
Yeah, and we had a business continuity exercise just last week, actually. We're running these quite regularly now, and we're using the Scottish Cyber Security Centre to support us in that. And they come in and run exercises which are thorough. The one last week was specifically around our tax system and how we would respond if there was an issue there. So I think it's something that will always be high up in terms of our approach to risk as an organisation. And the only way to prepare yourself for it is to practice, because one of the things that the experts have told us is it's not a question of if, it's a question of when. So what you have to do is you have to be ready insofar as you can. And as Aidan has said, you know, the board take it incredibly seriously, and we do as an executive too.
I would say training is essential here as well. And one of the mandates that we've done more recently is at board level, in terms of mandating that all board members have to go through an element of cybersecurity training, and we're using the Cybersecurity Centre and the governance training that they're doing around that, which is also very helpful, that all of us will have been through by the end of the year.
Okay, thanks, Roger. Thanks, Javier.
Thank you. I could only work from home if there was no chocolate or crisps in the house and there was a lock on the fridge, to which I did not have the key. Craig, to be followed by Liz.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning. Just one question briefly on organisational culture before I move into something probably more substantive. You've implemented a 35-hour working week. How is that panning out? And are you finding that some staff cannot do their job within that 35-hour working week? For example, Ms Lorimer, are you working 35 hours and capping it, or are you working presently more?
Well, thank you very much. The senior civil service are not affected by the 35-hour working week, so I can give you assurance I am working longer hours than that. Within our organisation, so this is something that, because we were on Scottish Government main terms and conditions, we had to implement. So we had a, as you would expect, at Revenue Scotland, we put a project together to work with our staff to see how we could make sure that we were able to accommodate that. And because we had actually the previous year reduced our working hours for the staff by 1 hour, it was actually just another hour that had to be found. The way in which we've taken it forward is we're really mindful about meetings. We're an organisation that loves meetings. So what we try and do is reduce our meeting times, question whether we need the meetings or not. And it is fair to say across the organisation, most staff are managing to work within that 35-hour working week. Because we are able to monitor staff's working hours, where we're finding that staff are regularly exceeding it, we are able to pick that up at their monthly conversation to talk to them about what can be done to improve their ability to adhere to it. So in general, across the organisation, we're managing to work within that 35-hour working week, and we're able to monitor if it's not working for particular individuals.
And just in practical terms, how do you monitor that? Is that when they log into the computer and log out, or is something more sophisticated?
Yes. So our staff are on a flexible working scheme. So, and as part of Oracle, the new Oracle system, they log in and they log out, and we get a monthly report on balances. So we're able to take quite immediate action if we're noticing that there's a problem.
Okay. You report a 99% tax collection rate in 2024-2025. For a layman, what does a 99% collection rate actually mean? It means
that 99% of the tax that was declared by taxpayers was received by us.
Are you concerned, the principal tax you're collecting at the moment is LBTT?
Yes.
Are you concerned that because of the operation of LBTT, the amount that's declared could actually be less than the amount that is actually due?
So that takes us to our role in terms of compliance. And we look at compliance from a risk basis. And we, through experience now as an organisation, are aware of the areas of particular types of transaction or the interaction, for example, between non-residential and residential tax, the opportunities that might be there for taxpayers So we focus on areas within LBTT where we see the greatest risk, and that's where we target our compliance. So you then look at our compliance yield, and you'll see that our compliance yield in the last year is in the order of £3 million, and most of that has been through LBTT.
So that 3 million it sounds significant, but for example, a few additional dwelling supplement transactions that you missed could actually quite quickly get you quite close to that figure.
So for additional dwelling supplement, that's an area where we've increased our activity. It's an area where we talked about data earlier and the importance of us being able to access data. So for additional dwelling supplement, we are really interested in due course being able to access data from local authorities around council tax and the second home premium that people pay now on council tax, because if we look at that alongside our ADS data, that will throw up issues, I'm sure, for us in the compliance field. So yes, for ADS, that's an area where we are increasing our compliance activity.
Fine. Talking to some estate agents, they're now saying that they're actually advising customers very early on in the process, even at that point before viewing, about the burden that LBTT and potentially ADS will put upon the transaction. But there is still a sense, when you speak to some conveyancing solicitors, that they're only as good as the information the client gives them. So you're obviously saying that you think that your compliance costs and your recoveries are quite good where you've anticipated something. But for example, if somebody is buying what appears to be their first property in the UK, happens to own a bolt hole in Slovenia, what is your capacity to actually find out that that ADS should apply to that? Because I'm assuming you're not trawling the land registry in Slovenia, for example.
No, that's right. So again, yes, again, we need to take a risk-based approach to the transactions that we look at, and the team are very expert now at being able to sample transactions as they come through, for example, and look for risk areas. This issue that you identified about the conveyancing solicitor is really important for us. And so we've been working, and we always have worked closely with the Law Society, but there are areas specifically now that we are talking to the Law Society about, which include what's the information that their solicitors are getting from clients? Is there an assurance point further up the chain that solicitors could be involved in that would make sure that they are getting the evidence that they should be getting to be able to make sure that their client is paying the right amount of tax? Ultimately, of course, it's for the client because it's a self-assessed tax. But yes, so the relationship we have with the Law Society is really important here. And it's something that we're taking forward.
I was just talking to our head of tax this morning, and this is a key area for continued investigation and seeing what other data sets we can access that could give indications of misbehaviour or effectively misrepresentation of what the property is. Because
one of the critical elements here is this concept, particularly for ADS, of being in an economic unit. So cohabiting couples, for example, will incur ADS even though they are not on the title deeds of their partner's property. That's going to be very, very complex for you to actually unpick, isn't it? There is an element within this tax that it's, if you choose to pay it, you're choosing to pay it.
Yes, there are particular scenarios around constructs of economic units and parties to transactions and things which are more complex. The ADS we actually think about it in Revenue Scotland as a tax, and we talk about LBTT, but actually there's LBTT and ADS, and it is, yes, it is. It's a significant tax, and so when we're looking at our compliance work now, a lot of our emphasis is on ADS. Not solely, but a lot of it's on ADS, and increasingly it's quite complex transactions which we're having to look at. And when we look at the cases that we have going ultimately to tribunal, the tribunal cases, some of them, the more complex ones, have been about ADS. So that means our staff need to have really solid tax experience, but they also need to be able to understand commercial constructs. They need to be able to understand these sort of tax-efficient ways in which people might construct their affairs, to be able to properly analyse and inquire into those sorts of transactions.
Are you aware that some individuals are looking potentially at trial separations for the period when the transaction goes through in order to be able to avoid the tax?
I think my team, who are in the nicest possible way, have the sharpest minds and the most cynical minds, you may say sometimes, are well aware of the ways in which it's possible, or people are attempting to circumvent the rules around ADS.
But you are aware, as that, you know, as the percentages increased, people will be increasingly inventive as the way to avoid what is quite a hefty bill.
It's an obvious conclusion to draw.
Okay, thank you very much.
Just one question from me on the data theme, where you quite rightly say that data is absolutely so important when it comes to the work that you do. Can I just ask, we've had quite a lot of discussions with the Scottish Fiscal Commission and with think tanks about the relevant data from the labour market, which has been flagged up to us as not being particularly accurate. And I just wondered, I mean, that's obviously crucial. The labour market trends are obviously crucial in terms of tax revenue. Does this problem affect you in any particular way? Are you aware of concerns over the lack of accurate data within labour market trends?
We're not so much concerned with the taxes that we have about labour market trends, but we are really interested in other data. So, for example, when we're thinking about aggregates tax, for example, the ability for the Fiscal Commission to accurately forecast what the revenues might be there is really difficult for them, because the data that we might need on a Scottish basis doesn't appear to exist. So the first couple of years of the operation of that tax will tell us what the revenues could be. So yes, data becomes really important for us around being able to work with the Commission on revenues, forecasting. And the other thing for us too around data, as we've mentioned, it's more about can we access data that exists elsewhere around other public bodies that will assist us in our compliance work. But no, the labour market trends data isn't necessarily something that concerns us.
But there's good cooperation with other public bodies that are trying to access this data, is there? So, because we are a tax authority, we have very rigorous rules around what we can share. In fact, it's an offence if we share protected taxpayer information without consent. So what we have been able to do is use the Digital Economy Act, which allows for data sharing between, we're named as a body covered by that Act, allows for us to share data but limited to areas where there could be fraud with local authorities. One of the things that we would really like to have brought forward is a wider ability for us to either share data, recognising there would need to be safeguards around it, or indeed seek data, to be able to ask for data from other public bodies or other entities who have data that would be useful to us. At the moment, we don't have these powers, and that's something that we're really keen to bring forward.
It'd be fair to say that we're engaging with the three key stakeholders that we would really like to be able to access more data from: HMRC, clearly registers and local authorities around land-based transactions. And that's something that we're keeping the debate live at this stage, because we see as a future, if we can get access subject to the rules of confidentiality to that data, it will make informed investigation, intelligent investigation, as well as challenge and also forecasting much more effective.
Okay, thank you very much. And that's concluded questions. In terms of the annual governance evidence session of Revenue Scotland, I just wonder if there's any further points you want to make before we conclude this part of our deliberations.
The only thing I would like to say, Convener, is thank you very much for inviting us and for your ongoing interest in our organisation. And it's been an absolute privilege to lead Revenue Scotland for the 9.5 years that I have. And one of the things that
I've always been mindful of is that it is Parliament to whom we are accountable. And having these sessions enables us to come and share with you what we've been doing, but also for you to probe away and ask just to satisfy yourselves that we are the efficient organisation that we think we are. So thank you very much for your ongoing interest.
Well, thank you. I'm not going to say goodbye just yet because you're about to take part in the session right now. But no, I think it's these are really important sessions, and they're really quite they're very interesting for the committee as well to see how Revenue Scotland is progressing. Okay, I'm going to call a 2-minute break for a changeover of witnesses. The next item on our agenda today is to take evidence from two panels as part of our scrutiny of the Building Safety Levy Scotland Bill. And for the first panel, we are joined by Revenue Scotland officials, Elaine Lorimer, Chief Executive, Michael Patterson, Head of Tax, John McVeigh, New Devolved Taxes Programme Manager, and James Lindsay, Tax Design Lead. Welcome everyone to the meeting. We have your written submissions, so we'll move straight to questions. Good morning all, and I note that this is going to be Scotland's fourth devolved tax, and one of the issues in relation to tax, which is often quoted, and you have it in your submission at 2.1, is the 4 Adam Smith's principles of taxation: certainty, efficiency, convenience and taxes that are proportionate to the ability to pay. Do you believe that this tax meets those criteria?
Of course, good morning, Convener, and thank you for inviting us here today. We, of course, interpret the Adam Smith principles from the perspective of the operation of the taxes, not the policy behind the tax in the first instance. And I would say, obviously, where we are in the legislative timetable for SBSL, as we call it, there's clearly some areas where there still requires to be additional work done to bring more clarity to the legislation, and we're expecting that obviously as the bill proceeds and the secondary legislation too. But for Revenue Scotland, what really matters to us is that we have a tax that is capable of being administered well and efficiently, and that means that we have to have a tax that is clear, not just for us as the tax authority, but also for taxpayers. And we've been working with Scottish Government policy officials over the coming months to try and achieve that.
And where do you feel that you are in terms of that process?
So I'll hand over to Mike, I think, initially for that. But from where we are is working closely with officials. We obviously understand what is in stage 1 of the bill, and we know that as stage 2 comes forward, there's likely to be some further clarification. But I'll hand over to Mike.
Thank you. I think we're in a very good position vis-à-vis our Scottish Government colleagues. James, to my right here, is his title is Tax Design Lead, so he is leading for Revenue Scotland to making sure that the tax design itself works, is efficient, and is going to be well understood by taxpayers, is capable of being implemented in a digitally efficient way. So we are working very, very closely with them and have been right since the very beginning, so that engagement continues. Indeed, we've been asked to take on responsibility for some elements of trying to engage with the industry by users, taxpayers, to make sure that we can make recommendations through to Scottish Government of particular aspects to make sure that they work efficiently. I don't know, James, is there anything you want to add in terms of those areas that we're working on too?
Sure. James can comment on it. I mean, he said, you know, make sure the tax works. What do you actually mean by that? Because I mean, one of the issues that's been raised, and kind of John Mason touched on it in the previous session, is that, you know, Revenue Scotland are very proud of the fact that, you know, less than 1% of the revenue is used in administration. I don't think anybody thinks that's going to be the case here. You'd be talking about £300,000 for a tax take, hopefully, of around £30 million. So what do you actually mean by a tax working? Because, I mean, you know, you can collect money, but where is the efficiency, effectiveness, you know, kind of acceptability? Where do all these things fit in, for example, Mr Lindsay?
I can take that initially, Chair, I think. So from our perspective, when Mike refers to a tax working, that's us thinking about it from the perspective of, can we administer it? Can we do so in a way which is digitally efficient? Are we able to put guidance out on our website that brings as much clarity as possible to taxpayers so they understand what their obligations are? That's what we're talking about. We're talking about a tax working. In relation to our costs, we have pared our costs right back in relation to building safety levy as the tax design is becoming more apparent to us since our financial memorandum. So we're now talking about yearly running costs, as you say, of around £300,000 a year, which takes us almost within that 1% of the £30 million tax take.
Interesting, because we understood it was going to be significantly higher than that. You know, that much, a factor of 10 or more. So that's a really interesting comment that you've actually made there, and I think it's very significant that because obviously you can pare it back, but obviously there has to be, you know, there's a balance to be struck between paring back in terms of efficiency of expenditure on collection and ensuring that you do actually collect the money. And I mean, you know, it's so. Do you feel you're at that optimum point?
Oh, yeah. Well, we're
as the bill stands.
As the bill stands, I think yes. That's
Poor James hasn't had a word in yet, but never mind.
So we'll bring him in. Of course, what this is going to require is us to have a really digitally efficient way of collecting the tax, of collecting the revenues. And so you'll see from the financial memorandum, there's an initial setup cost. That is based around getting our digital system in place to be able to collect. So when I talk about the yearly running costs, it's after that initial setup. I can bring James in about how we are working with the industry to understand what they're going to require of us, so that we can make sure that the operation of the tax is as easy for them as possible. James, do you want to?
Sure. So I think from the tax design standpoint, which is my role, probably the most important thing for me is to be, and for the organisation, is to be involved with the bill team from the onset of the tax. In fact, we were involved prior to the onset of the tax throughout the design of the Ordering Council, which is got a Minister of Power to bring in the tax, which has really helped us understand how the tax works, and also be involved with the Scottish Government's engagement with external stakeholders from the early stages, involved in expert advisory groups, and as Mike mentioned, we've taken the lead in some more specific and technical areas that we can add value to for the bill team. And being part of that process from the beginning really helps us to have more clarity in how the tax will go forward. There are still some areas that needs to be worked out, and we're working closely with the bill team in order to maximise our understanding and get information from external stakeholders in order to inform that process.
I think I was going to add an example of where the tax could be seen to not work if we hadn't, if the design wasn't put in place properly. So a key consideration for taxpayers is that the cash flow position in terms of when they pay the tax. So you could, when is the tax triggered? When is it actually payable? That's been pushed as late on in the process as possible, and we've ensured that the considerations about when the tax becomes payable after that, there's sufficient time for the taxpayer to have gathered the monies in that they would then pay out as the tax. So there's an example, if you like, of how tax design can influence making the tax work better for both us as a revenue authority, but more importantly for taxpayers as well.
Of course, the developers who are less than enthusiastic still don't think it's late enough, as you'll probably be well aware. I mean, the initial setup costs, I mean, you're paying back collection costs, but what the initial setup costs, has there been any downward pressure on those, or are those still the kind of 3.7 million that we were led to believe?
Yeah, if I may, Convener, I'll bring John in to answer that.
Sure.
Yes, Convener. Yeah, there has been. So the initial costs that we provided for the financial memorandum were very much risk-based. There wasn't a lot of information, there wasn't a lot of weren't a lot of requirements available to us. So we have looked at the programme costs, we've looked at the running costs for staff, and we're also looking at the IT costs as well. So with regard to the programme, we've reduced our head count. We had a planned on bringing in 3 members of staff to the team. We're bringing in 1 instead. We're looking at the staffing costs for ongoing running, and again, they will reduce, and we're very confident that the IT costs will reduce as well. And that's as a result of the unknowns becoming known. So like that, at the outset, we're unable to tell our IT provider very much detail around how this tax will work. But as we've worked closely with the bill team and as legislation and policy develops, we can start to refine the requirements, and yeah, with a view to driving down the costs. So we are confident the direction of travel is indicating that those costs will reduce also.
In paragraph 1.4 of your submission, you say Revenue Scotland has and continues to give advice, support and assistance to the Scottish Government in relation to a practical impact on the administration of the tax regime contemplated by this bill. So do you have concerns about some of the practicalities of the introduction of this bill as is being suggested?
So we don't have concerns about the practicalities, so long as we can get the issue for us is that we make sure that we have the bill through and the secondary legislation through in time. That's the practical issue for us, in time to enable us to administer the tax within the time frame that ministers are asking. So there's detail in the bill, but as ever with tax legislation, there will be more practical detail, if you like, within the secondary legislation. So the pressure really, as we see it, collectively between us and Scottish Government is to make sure that we get not just the bill through, but that we also get the secondary legislation through in time. And we're working closely with officials to try and achieve that.
In what nature of this bill has been raised as well. I mean, and just not, lastly for me, in the final paragraph of your submission, you say, the ongoing revenue costs of delivering the tax in its live state will also depend on areas of tax design yet to be finalised. So it seems as if there's still a few wee things that are we're a bit unsure of.
So I'll answer that first and then I'll hand over to Mike. So yes, so for example, I think I mentioned in our earlier evidence about data and information powers. So one of the areas that we're really keen to make sure that we get right here is the access that we have to data sets that exist elsewhere. Because if we're able to do that, that will make our compliance work more digitally enabled and more efficient. So there are some real the practicalities for us around this are around how we're able to administer it and do so in a way which is data driven and digitally enabled. But Mike, you might be able to come in with some more.
Yeah, the example I actually gave earlier on about the return period, for example, would that be based on, say, a quarterly basis or a monthly basis, or would a transaction have to be returned to us after each completion of every house? That's the sort of practical involvement that we would have in helping design an efficient tax. Now, those bits of the detail, we have a good understanding of how we think that will go, but until that's actually finalised, and that will come through in secondary legislation, for example, what the return period would be, that's the sort of level of detail that we would need to work on. But James is working very closely with the bill team in terms of formulating what the recommendations will be for those regulations.
And I would add to that, there's major products for all taxes, things like the tax return, and for the tax you've got registration systems. So in working with our IT providers, building that tax return and doing it at the same time as the bill has been developed and secondaries being developed creates certain difficulties in understanding how the tax is going to work and how that will flow through to an actual practical tax return and a tax return system. So we're working closely, again, with the bill team and with our IT providers to make that system as seamless as possible. But just, as you mentioned, the framework bill, it makes it slightly more difficult, but it's not insurmountable. And we've put a preparation in place to manage that.
Diplomatic use of the word slightly there, I thought I appreciate that.
I think many times that simply from a tax authority's perspective, what we would really like is all the legislation tied up in a neat bundle and then give us a year or two, then take it forward to implementation. So that's not what we're in the situation with necessarily here. And so where there is greater risk for us around successful implementation is where the policy is being developed alongside our preparation with our systems and our guidance and our processes. And that's what we really want to try and avoid as much as possible here.
We're quite keen on that as well, actually, I have to say. Nice, neat bundles. But where we are. Okay, I'm going to open out the session to colleagues around the table now. Michael, to be followed by John.
Thanks, Convener, and nice to see you all. In the submission at 6.3, you said the Scottish Building Safety Levy does not have a UK-wide equivalent. The closest parallel is the England-only Building Safety Levy. I mean, is it not really an equivalent? I don't quite understand the distinction. Could you tell us the distinction between the two and why you don't believe it to be an equivalent levy that
yes,
essentially does the same thing?
The point we were making there is, unlike the other taxes that we have devolved, there has been an established UK tax. So aggregates tax, for example, there's an established UK tax. So there's lots of precedent and learning that we can take from HMRC in relation to that. This one is different because it's essentially starting from a blank sheet of paper. So that's what we're talking about in relation to that.
Okay, so it's the first new tax, in essence, as you see it, because it's been done in a new at the same time in England and Wales. Okay, that's a useful distinction. I mean, given the lack of clarity that you've been able to offer, and I realise, I think the point is that the policy isn't there. I mean, it seems to me to be quite worrying the lack of certainty that's provided. And your last comment, Elaine, was, I think, quite damning in some respects in terms of your confidence in the ability to actually deliver a tax that's workable, given the absence of some of the key priorities. So I just want to probe some of that a little bit more. On the discussions, have you had discussions with UK colleagues about the parallel development of the new tax? And could you maybe say a little bit about the considerations that they are having at the same time?
So first of all, I wasn't intending to be damning. I was just saying what in an ideal world the tax authority would like, but we don't live in an ideal world, do we really, in terms of these matters. So I would like to give you assurance that we are working as closely as we possibly could with the Bill team. In fact, it's a great example of joint working in terms of them working closely with us to understand what we need and bringing our tax experience to bear in terms of the policy development. In relation to contact with HMRC, I am aware that we have had contact, I think, with one member of staff down south, haven't we?
Yes, certainly in terms of key design aspects of the design, and in terms of working out how the industry operates. It's not a tax that's been administered by HMRC, but we understand that the expertise in terms of how developments, particularly residential developments owned by large corporates, how they will be structured in terms of ownership and so on, to make sure that the rules that are being designed will work properly in those areas. So that's the work that we've done with HMRC. But I'd like to come back in terms of the timing. As Elaine has said, we absolutely, it would be ideal if we had everything tied up neatly and ready, and then, say, a long period of time to implement this. But we've really got to be conscious that of the purpose of this tax, and that's to raise funds for the remediation work. So we understand that pressure for the tax to be raised to go towards that. But what I would assure you is that one of the reasons why we brought John is because John his absolutely key role is to make sure that we plan properly, that we understand what we need to know, when we need to know it, so that we can inform our design and the design of the tax. And we have formed plans that we are confident. It will be tight, but we are working hard on it. We are confident that we will meet whatever time scale that the Minister offers in terms of the start date of the tax.
In those discussions then with HMRC, I mean, it sounds like a very limited engagement around, I think, a very significant piece of work that they're undertaking. Do you understand the rationale that they've taken for doing it on a policy level, but on a local authority basis, as opposed to a national tax? Why have they taken that approach and we're taking a different one?
It's not an HMRC tax, so it's not one that they're taking forward. The tax, as it's constituted in England, is delivered through 320 local authorities. One might argue in 320 different ways, with 320 lots of costs. So I think in terms of efficiency, we don't know what their costs will be yet, but every local authority, the legislation in England sets out that every local authority can deduct those fees, the costs that they have to incur, before that levy is paid over to the Ministry of Housing. Whereas we're doing it through one authority, there will be only one tax authority that builders, developers have to interact with.
Do you not think that there's a risk then about lack of sensitivity to local circumstances? That's part of the evidence we've had from house builders, that a one-size-fits-all approach across the whole of the country risks impacting very different housing markets, Edinburgh versus the Highlands, and what that will actually mean. Whereas I understand your point about efficiency, but part of the trade-off in this will be greater sensitivity to local circumstances.
And of course, that's a policy matter for how the tax is finally constructed. I think what our job is to do is to make sure that once those policy decisions have been made, we are able to have guidance systems and processes in place that if there is local discretion, if that is built in, ultimately, I don't know whether it will or it won't, we're able to administer that. But ultimately, that's a matter for ministers in terms of the policy for the tax and how they want to take account of local variances.
That feels pretty fundamental to how it's going to operate. And you're suggesting that we're at stage one in the parliamentary process here, but you think that there could be a scheme that came forward that allowed for local operation. I mean, that's just for your work as Revenue Scotland. That would be a fundamental way that you've changing the issue, wouldn't it?
Ultimately, though, what will happen, I don't want to make our job sound too simple, but ultimately what will happen is taxpayers will make a return, and it will be what information is required in that on that return that will determine what is to be paid. So if there are differences in approach, the way that would be dealt with would be by way of a drop-down menu on the return. So, you know, for us, it's about understanding what variations there could be, and if there are to be any, how we build that into things like the tax return at the very beginning that they would then flow through.
I can possibly give you another illustration of the difference between what information is needed at what stage in the process and how our needs would differ from the needs of perhaps the taxpayer. So one of the key components of the tax design is the levy-free allowance, that annual allowance. You can well understand that taxpayers are acutely keen to know where that will be set, what the number will be set at. But from our perspective, so long as we know there will be a number, when we can build the system that will slot in whatever number needs to go in. As long as we know of its existence and how it will work, what the actual number will be won't matter to the setting up of the design. So there's different needs for people, but we've got to be very conscious that taxpayers will want to know that, because we've got to give them the guidance. So the things about the local market variations, so long as we know that there will be variations, we can actually build that into the tax return. That's relatively speaking, that's further down the line, and isn't actually a fundamental point.
Distinction about design here. So there's a design of the policy, which it actually does, and then the design of your systems, which are in essence two different things. I think that's worthy of a clarification. On the timing, I mean, the process of this in the legislative and policy development side of it feels very different to the Scottish aggregates tax, and you've set out as to perhaps why some of that is at the moment. But we were able as a committee to look at that tax and say we knew that the rate had not been set, but we understood the mechanisms, we understood the general impact of it. But when we came to this stage as a committee around the Scottish aggregate tax, it was pretty clear to us what we were getting as a country as a result of it. I mean, this both simultaneously feels to me to be very slow. We're 8.5 years on from Grenfell and the need to deal with this huge problem, but also it feels incredibly rushed at this point to try and pull it together. I mean, could you tell us a little bit about the contrast that you've found between those two processes, developing SAT and developing this as a tax?
Yes, and the starting point, of course, is different, because the starting point for aggregates tax was something that was already destined to be devolved as a result of the combination of Smith and Kalman Commission. So this, on the other hand, is an area where ministers didn't have the powers. So there was a long process, which I'm sure the minister will be able to talk to you about achieving the powers for ministers via an order in council. And my understanding is this is the first of tax such as this where an order of council has been granted by the UK government. So that in itself was a long process of negotiation, quite sensitive negotiation between Scottish Government officials and UK Government officials. So the starting point of do we have the powers to introduce this took a while. And then it's what do you introduce in Scotland that will work in the Scottish environment. And again, that has taken time, I think, for officials to get to grips with, working closely with the industry to understand the pressures in the industry, while at the same time adhering to the terms of the order in council. They're quite constrained around the order in council. So what can be introduced can only be within the powers that ministers have been granted. But what I can say to you is we've been involved with officials from the very early stages before the order in council was granted. We were involved there, and that is earlier than for any of our other taxes. So from the working relationship between Revenue Scotland and between policy officials within the Scottish Government. This is actually a really good example of bringing us in right at the very beginning, so that we are able to help shape the design of a tax insofar as it's relevant to listen to us around our tax experience.
So when will taxpayers know what they have to pay and the date?
So you'll have to ask Mr McKee that, who I think is coming in after us. But normally that will be the rates and bands of our other taxes are announced by ministers in due course, aren't they, as part of the budget or as part of their final stages of introduction of the legislation. So that would be something you'll need to ask him.
Okay, I will do it. There was great concern from the industry that the lack of horizon for being able to predict their investment profiles for housing at a point at which we have an incredibly low completion rate for housing in Scotland, a national housing emergency. I mean, that has to be a concern, that there's no visibility to people making those investment decisions at this point, unless this is years in the future. Is that...
I understand that, and you know, one of the things that we have always said about this, but about aggregates tax, and we said it before about air departure tax when we were looking at introducing it some years back, that it's important that Revenue Scotland has clarity so that we can provide the guidance and get taxpayers ready. But actually what is really important is that taxpayers know. So the sooner that taxpayers have the clarity that they are seeking, the better.
Would you think would be reasonable?
Again, that's...
There's two levels to that. You've referenced the requirement for taxpayers to be able to plan economically for whether a housing development would be viable or not. So that's one level of planning. I totally understand that, but from our perspective of designing a tax system, what certainty do they need to be able to understand how to pay the tax? That's a separate matter, and probably a shorter timescale than they would require to work out whether a particular development is viable or not. That's a separate consideration. So they need it on two levels, but from our perspective, to make it work, you only need so many months beforehand for the rate to be announced, but that's not the same point for taxpayers to be able to understand how it impacts on their business.
And there's been a decision in the rest of the UK to delay this form of the equivalent or non-equivalent, tax in the rest of the UK. Is it partly on that basis to give companies sight? Do you know?
James, I understood it was going ahead.
Oh, there was a delay, I think, of maybe it was 6 months, so a year for the UK tax.
A year, I think.
Yeah, and that's as far as I don't know.
You've not had that
I don't know the
conversation
decision offhand exactly why that was.
Okay, just on the policy level as well. Finally, final question from me. Some of the language that's been used around this is a polluter pays principle, but there are many of these companies who build houses who have never used the products that are at question, that have put lives at risk, and never will, but are being asked to pay this levy. You have to maintain relationships with the sector. Is that language that you've used, polluter pays, and do you think it's appropriate to the tax?
Certainly not language that we would use at all.
Thank you.
Thank you. John, to be followed by Craig.
Thanks very much, Convener. Just one or two things. I don't know if you were involved in this, but I mean, the estimate is that there's going to be £30 million coming in, and I'm not entirely sure who has calculated that. I think it is based on what the UK would be getting, but we've got a slightly different system. So have you been involved in that as to how much is coming in, or is that just a figure you're given and you work with it?
Yes, that's a figure that ultimately, of course, will be determined by the Fiscal Commission. And I don't think we will be involved in that because we don't have any information to provide the Fiscal Commission in the way that we have for our other taxes at this point. So no, we've not been involved in the establishment of that figure.
I can ask the Minister about that. One of the differences with the UK system, I think, is the timing of when people declare or pay. Is that something you were involved in discussing, and from an efficiency point of view or practical point of view, collecting it, is that a good time, what we're proposing for the declaration and the payment?
Yeah. Do you want to take that, Mike?
That's very much the example I was giving as an illustration earlier on. There's always going to have to be a compromise in there somewhere. Somebody, well, can we pay it next year? Can we pay it a year later? There's always got to be a balance between when's the effective time in terms of a taxpayer's cash flow versus when's administratively a reasonable point to collect that tax. So we're certainly involved in those discussions to determine what's the optimum point in terms of protecting the revenue, but at the same time making sure that the taxpayer has sufficient reserves to pay the tax.
Because, I mean, the English system of actually not giving them a certificate, if I understand that correctly, is quite a kind of, well, draconian, if you like, but it's quite definite and, you know, almost would seem to me, at least, to imply they've got to, you know, if they want to sell the building, they're going to have to do it. Whereas with us, is it a little bit less certain?
Less certain in terms
that, well, they will comply, that they will pay.
We have, I think, in terms of evidence that's been given forward by Elaine in previous sessions about our efficiency in terms of collecting tax. I think we've got a good track record. The nature of this particular tax involves very obviously large immobile assets that have many touch points with the Scottish state, if you like, through local authorities or through Scottish Government. We know where the houses are. We know who the developers are. I think it was a policy decision whether to include that conditionality or not, but we're quite comfortable that we can administer the tax without that conditionality that's present.
So if someone didn't pay for some reason, there'd just be a penalty like we're talking about
penalty,
earlier.
And it's for us to go and collect it, yes.
Okay, and my final point was in your input or contribution that you sent us, the phases, it's on 4.5. I was just wondering if this is the normal order for things, because phase 1 it says business case, but actually it's not happening first, because the first thing is phase 2, design and development of the programme, January 25 to June 25, and only after that, development of the business case. Is that a normal timescale?
Yeah, so the design and development of the programme was put together as the requirement for Revenue Scotland was being discussed with the Bill team, and we're getting awareness of the policy and the legislation. We then, once we had some detail, we were able to start working on the business case. So we're following the 5-case business case. So we needed information to be available to inform that. So yeah, the design and the development of the programme is understanding what the requirement is, and then moving into developing the business case based on that requirement.
Right. Okay, that's fair enough. Thanks, Convener.
Thank you. To follow by Liz.
Thank you, Convener. Just a couple of quick questions. In respect to I think any of us who've had casework in relation to property developers where something has gone wrong on behalf of our constituents and you've then checked out the individual, there's often many limited companies and other corporate constructs created around their business. How alert are you to that practice within the property development industry? And if you aren't going to make directors, for example, liable for recovery of tax, how alert are you to the evolving nature of those corporate structures that, unless you, at the point of completion certificate, recover the monies, that it may mean that those who are unscrupulous could find ways around this system?
So within Revenue Scotland, we've got some really good expertise around working with business. When I look at the teams that we have and their backgrounds, so that understanding of constructs of commercial entities plays out across our existing taxes, and that's some of the expertise that we would bring to bear here. I don't know, Mike, if you want to add anything else on top of that.
It's exactly that. So one of the key areas that James has been working on is precisely that level of understanding and safeguards that we need to do. Yeah. Anything you want to add, James?
Yeah, leaning on some of the engagement with industry experts exactly on that point, so we can best understand the corporate and other types of structures that developers will have or use, so we can best understand risk and then how we should apply the rules to prevent that risk. They prevent non-compliance.
So, for example, the legislation is, what a small development is, for example, and exempts that. How, in practical terms, could you get round a developer who takes a 20 property development, doing it under the guise of 4 corporate entities who develop 5 homes each.
In tax terms, it's connected party rules, you would say. So you've got a corporate group, company A owns company B and company C. They could put company D and company E and F and take advantage of the levy-free allowance. We create connected party rules to treat them as one entity, so they only get one levy-free allowance balance. But there's complexities with depending on the complexity of the structure, so that's what we're looking to understand right now. We're doing a scoping exercise to best understand the different types of complex structures out there in order to inform our connected party rules to prevent that sort of manipulation.
It's definitely an area that we are very alive to. It's very familiar in broader areas of tax, so we're leaning on that broader tax experience of how you would deal with that. So other taxes at UK level, etc., have very similar concepts that we're borrowing on to make sure that it's incorporated into the rules.
Fine. Obviously, a lot of the devil of the detail of this will be in the secondary legislation. The penalty regime, presumably you don't want to be disproportionate, but you do want it to make sure that it is a disincentive to anybody to misbehave. How far are you down the road of actually constructing what you perceive what the penalties would be to ensure that they're both proportionate and that the industry has some foresight on them?
Well, Royal Scotland has an established penalty regime and tax framework for other taxes, and so Scottish Building Safety Levy will essentially bolt onto that existing penalty framework. At this point in time, there's been no decision to have any specific types of penalties for SPSL because our existing tax framework should cover us for what we're looking for. If it does come to the realisation that we need an existing penalty, we're working with the government in order to introduce that.
And presumably failure to register would be one of those.
That's already in
that would attract a penalty. Yeah, fine. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. Liz will be followed by Michelle.
Thank you. I know you can't comment upon policy tax decisions, but in light of the information that we've had back from a number of stakeholders, are you concerned about the level of criticism about the potential unintended consequences of this tax? And is that any part of the discussions you've had with the Scottish Government?
We understand the commentary that's being made, but that is, as you say, that's essentially a policy matter. We are acutely alive to what implications that could have in terms of the design, etc. But we probably don't have anything else to offer beyond that.
But just in relation to that you are aware of potential impact, is that something that the Scottish Government has discussed with you?
I don't think it's something they necessarily need to discuss with us because that's a pure policy matter in terms of, for example, what a levy-free allowance would look like, what impact there could be have in terms of any transitional rules or whatever. That's a pure policy matter in which we wouldn't necessarily have any particular
Does it
views.
concern you at all, though, about the level of criticism, particularly through this committee, that we've heard from stakeholders? Is that a warning signal about this tax that potentially could bring about unintended consequences? It's been put to us quite frequently in the evidence that we've taken and through the submissions that we've received that there are quite a lot of unintended consequences that are possible. Plus there's the issue that Mr Mara referred to, whereby some people who could end up paying the tax are actually not responsible for the problem. And going back to what you started with about the principles of Adam Smith, I mean, these are surely very important principles in terms of the delivery of the tax. And is it a concern to you, irrespective that you can't comment on the specific policy issue, that people are unhappy about some of this?
Well, it's rare to find an individual or a company who's delighted to pay tax. So, but seriously, in terms of listening to the industry and listening to stakeholders, that's certainly something that we place at the heart of how we design our approach to the administration of tax. And so we've been very much involved with Scottish Government in terms of the expert advisory group and engaging with the stakeholders. So when Mike says he's aware, it's because we've sat in rooms and heard. Ultimately, it's for ministers, obviously, to make those decisions.
But I guess from a tax authority's perspective, once the tax goes live, it's down to us to make sure that we can administer it well. And that's where our concerns, if there are any, would come in, would be that we have a tax which we think we can operate and do so well.
I completely understand that, because it is your job to make it work. I absolutely get that. But this committee is looking at the tax policy as well as the role that you have. And what I'm trying to ask is, are you aware that the Scottish Government is concerned about the level of criticism that has so far been received? Never mind what the policy might end up as being. Are you aware of that within your discussions with the Scottish Government?
They've been, obviously, because they run the expert advisory groups and engage with the industry, they will have heard from those stakeholder groups. What I can't tell you is what they're doing on the back of that. That's for them to discuss with you. But they certainly, the industry has made, the points they've made to the committee, they've made elsewhere.
But just on the final point, I mean, would you think that the issues that they are talking to you about with this tax are more concerning than the ones that they're talking about with other taxes? Do you feel that the Scottish Government thinks there are more concerns about the potential for this tax to have problems than is the case for other tax policies? That's all you need to answer.
I think from my perspective and from our perspective, I think without doubts this tax has its complexities, and as part of the complexities that are associated with, we've started from a blank sheet of paper. So I think that needs to be taken into account here. And so there isn't something that the industry or Scottish Government can fall back on, if you like. So because of that, the engagement with the industry and listening to the industry while also holding on to the policy intent is quite a difficult job for the officials in the Scottish Government to do. And that's one of the reasons why we are so pleased that we've been involved, because we can assist them with that.
I think from quite a number of the stakeholders, I think their concern is a bit broader than that, namely that they feel that there are too many potential circumstances where there might be unintended consequences. Now, I don't think that's all to do with the fact that it's a new tax in that sense and there isn't data that you can fall back on. I think there are serious concerns about the implications of how the Adam Smith principles might apply to that. I think, as I say, I know you can't answer from a policy perspective, Minister. But I think that's, yeah.
But we're certainly alive to making sure the bits that we can control, the bits that are not policy-based, we will make sure that the tax works efficiently and effectively. That's our key drivers.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Michelle?
I just wanted to follow up what Craig Hoy was picking up on in terms of specifically house building companies commonly use special purpose vehicles, particularly for phasing. They're extremely common, and clearly that does represent a risk in your ability to be able to collect. And I know you obviously already mentioned connected parties, and that's a standard way, but it is more complex than that because of the way that the point at which payment will occur being quite late on the process and deliberately set to be so by the Scottish Government, because usually the normal remedy in the events of everything else would be to ensure collection up front. And that seems to me, or as much as possible, that seems to me to be quite a risk. So what assessment have you made of the risks around cost of collection in this scenario? Because it can be, I mean, the other remedies you have, they can be quite expensive and they're time consuming.
So cost of collection here is about the compliance effort that we put in, because what you're, I think, talking about there is what's our approach to compliance going to be for those more complex constructs. So we've built into, because we're so mindful of the revenues here, we've built in, it's a small team for building safety levy. I mean, we're talking about 3 additional compliance staff who will focus on building safety levy. So much of their work will be, I would imagine, although Mike and James can come in, will be on focusing on those risk areas That's why we need to make sure that our system is set up in such a way that it's the easier payments that come through can be made without us having to do much compliance intervention. I would imagine when we're looking at this tax when it's live, it will be at those sorts of areas that we'll want to target our initial compliance activity. But
and sorry, before you come in, I mean, that's a standard, sensible approach. What I'm trying to kind of tease out is the risks around the detail coming through under secondary legislation where you go, oh, right, okay, I wish we'd known that up front. Because, you know, the figure that's been bandied around of 30 million, the basis for that is pretty loose, and I think only time will tell.
Yes, so the approach that we would take there then is if we are finding that we are needing to put more resources to the tax to make sure that it is running efficiently and running as intended. If we feel that we need additional resources for that, that's something that we would need to pick up with Scottish Government later on in the process. Our starting point, though, would be, can we bring folks from elsewhere in Revenue Scotland to bear on it, or do we actually need additional staff? But obviously what we've done is we didn't just say it's 30 million, so it's 300,000, so that's we were a bit more sophisticated than that. But we are conscious that because it's a new tax, we do need to, in this instance, build a small team that's going to focus on it. Because we've got some really excellent tax staff, including James, working on the tax design, it means that we will hopefully inherit something which is capable of being well administered. And because we've got some staff supporting James in the tax design, it means that our team who eventually take up the role of the compliance team for this will not be starting from a blank sheet of paper. We'll be starting from already a deep understanding of the tax and the policy behind it.
But do you not think there's risks? You know, down south it's going to be linked. You can't get a completion certificate until you've paid the tax, and that's not the plan here. That seems to be a kind of...
We run self-assessed taxes already, where you don't necessarily have that external control to prevent something unless you pay the tax. That's how self-assessed taxes work. But we are absolutely acutely aware. I mean, the concerns you're raising around SPVs, for example, that's pure tax design, where we will bring our experience to that to say, well, you need to work about this situation here, or if that happens, well, how will the rules cope with that? So James is really deep in that level of thought, and some of those details are capable of being amended. So if we, and that's a key issue for us, is that tax doesn't sit still. And so we may have to make sure that there is capable of having a maintenance programme to make sure it is up to date. So that would be the sort of thing that would come forward in that sort of maintenance bill. So no, we've found an area over here, or that definition's not working quite well over there. We need to tweak it. That's how tax works. So that would be. But our role at the moment is to make sure that we anticipate and prevent.
Yeah. And that, I think, the complexity of this and the detail we're both agreeing is required plays into the timescales you earlier alluded to, Elaine, in terms of this has got to be done for you to have a level of comfort that the tax can be collected in the manner in which...
I could contrast that with the example I gave earlier on, where the taxpaying public will be acutely wanting to know what the levy-free allowance is set at, for example, where it doesn't matter to us, it's less to us in terms of the timing of that. Whereas the one you're talking about here, the outside world may not be particularly interested in what are the particular rules about how SPVs are accounted for, and for us, actually, that's the other. We really want to know that level of detail, and we are working on that, looking at the possibilities and how that will be designed. We're looking at that now, so that we can advise the Scottish Government in terms of how that should be structured. So that detail will emerge, but we are there helping the Scottish Government decide what those rules should look like when they eventually do come through.
And last week question in terms of the Council's involvement in terms of being able to use Section 75 as another mechanism for kind of warding off bad behaviour. Are they involved in discussions around this as well?
We do have representation from COSLA on my programme board to help advise. We're not specifically dealing with the potential of Section 75 because it's not a tax as such. That would be an additional control that we don't have that built in at the moment. But yeah.
Absolutely. Right. Okay. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you for your evidence today. Is there anything else you wish to point out or
No,
to
thank
the
you. Thank you for
committee?
having us.
No, you feel as if everything's been covered? Okay. Well, I just want to thank you, Elaine, for all the years of service that you've given so far to Revenue Scotland, and wish you all the best on your retirement. I'm sure you'll be sadly missed by your colleagues and indeed by Parliament, so I wish you all the very best.
Thank you
in your
very much.
future
Thank you,
endeavours.
Convener. Thank you.
And with that, I'll just have a 2-minute break to allow a changeover of witnesses.
Thank you.
We continue our evidence taking on the Building Safety Levy Scotland Bill, and I welcome to the meeting Ivan McKee MSP, Minister for Public Finance, supported by the following officials: Stephen Lee Ross, Director, Directorate for Cladding, Scottish Government; Lorraine King, Deputy Director, Directorate for Tax, Scottish Government; Hannah Taylor, Bill Team Leader, Directorate for Tax, Scottish Government; and Hugh Angus, Lawyer, Scottish Government Legal Department. And I refer members to my register of interests. I'd like to welcome our witnesses to the meeting and invite the Minister to make a short opening statement. Good morning, Minister.
Good morning, Convener, and thank you for inviting me to give evidence to the committee this morning on the Scottish Building Safety Levy, which, as the committee will know, was in response to the Grenfell tragedy. The Scottish Government had initially called for a Four Nations approach to cladding remediation, including how it should be funded. However, the UK Government pressed ahead with proposals for an England-only measure through the Building Safety Act 2022, which provided for the introduction of a building safety levy on the development of new residential buildings. In the absence of an equivalent levy in Scotland, the introduction of a levy in England would create a gap in the funding available to address cladding remediation in Scotland. It would also mean that developers would contribute to the cost of cladding remediation in England through a building safety levy, but not in Scotland. As the committee will be aware, the Scottish Government's capital budget position is challenging over the medium term, with cladding remediation expenditure representing a significant and sustained pressure. Therefore, our programme for government in 24-25 contained a commitment to introduce a Scottish building safety levy to support the funding of cladding works in Scotland. The estimated revenues from the levy will be in the region of £360 million to £450 million over its expected lifetime. With no corresponding block grant adjustment, these revenues will make an important contribution to the estimated £1.7 billion cost of the Scottish Government's cladding remediation programme. The committee has just heard from Revenue Scotland about the collaborative approach we have taken with them in co-designing the bill, utilising their extensive experience and expertise in tax collection, and the financial memorandum for the bill sets out the indicative costs for Revenue Scotland's administration of the levy, which at 2% are small relative to the overall revenues and proportionately less than the UK Government's costs. The bill sets out provisions for a Scottish building safety levy that broadly align with provisions for the equivalent levy in England to ensure consistency for those operating on both sides of the border. However, in some areas we have taken a distinctive approach to adapt to the Scottish context. For example, we responded to concerns from parts of the industry around the tax point for the UK levy being too early in the development process, which may cause cash flow issues. We have also designated Revenue Scotland as a collection authority rather than UK Government's approach of designating responsibility to each of England's 296 local authorities, thus making the process in Scotland easier for developers. Throughout the process of development of the bill, we have been mindful of the strong need for new housing in Scotland and the importance of avoiding disproportionate impacts on the viability of new development projects. That's why we have gone further on exemptions, by including exemptions for developments built on islands, recognising the acute housing pressures that Scotland's island communities face. And our levy-free allowance is designed to protect small and medium-sized developers who would be less able to absorb the costs of any levy. Taken together, the measures in the bill are intended to target the areas of the house building sector where viability pressures are most likely to arise. Overall, however, we share the UK Government's assessment that the levy is not expected to have any significant macroeconomic impacts, and any negative impacts on supply will be small. Notwithstanding the above, I recognise that industry has raised significant concerns around the lack of clarity on levy introduction and the lead-in time needed between this and the publication of rates in advance. In response to that, and to ensure that industry has appropriate lead-in time, the commencement date for the levy will be deferred by 1 year until April 2028. In addition, the Scottish Government will set out indicative rates in June 2026 after the Scottish Parliament election has passed. The measures I'm setting out today will provide industry with around 22 months from the publication of rates to prepare for the introduction of the levy. Allowing for a significant period of lead-in time in this way means that the levy will apply to all relevant completion certificates accepted on or before 1st of April on or after 1st of April 2028, negating the need for complex transitional arrangements. The UK levy has received cross-party support, and the Building Safety Levy England regulations were recently passed unanimously, and I'm seeking to obtain a similar level of cross-party support in the Scottish Parliament. I very much welcome the committee's scrutiny of the bill, and I look forward to members' questions and the discussion ahead. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you very much for that opening statement. I mean, I think probably the most interesting thing to come out of it, obviously, is the one-year deferment, you know, which obviously has just come out of the blue as far as the committee is concerned now. The figures that he actually gave, you know, 360 to 450 million, I assume that's 12 to 15 years. And you talked about 1.7 billion. So we can talk about 20 to 25% of the cost of cladding being paid for effectively by this levy if it's collected at £30 million a year. But I'm just wondering, if it's going to be deferred to 2028, does this mean that work on cladding remediation by and large is going to be deferred, because there's only been a couple of buildings undertaken so far, and yet it's 8 years, more than 8 years since Grenfell?
Yeah, no, that's a good point. Well, effectively, if you obviously look at the numbers you've identified yourself, the total cost of remediation covered by the levy is a relatively small part in percentage terms. The remediation timetable, which obviously is outside the scope of what we're talking about directly here and has been taken forward by the Cabinet Secretary for Housing, is running to a timetable to move forward with that as fast as it can, and the ongoing work there around the call for buildings to be identified so that the assessment can be made of them, the funding that's in place for the assessment of those buildings, and the work to get developers signed up to that activity where the developer is identified. All of that is continuing, so that the delay on this has no impact to that. It's also worth recognising, if you look at the situation in England, yes, they're implementing earlier, but because of the transitional arrangements and because of the way this is configured in England earlier in the process at the building control stage rather than completion certificate, they recognise that there's quite a lead-in. So the revenues in England in the first year are a very small percentage of the total revenues they expect to get in future years when everything has flushed through the transitional arrangements, whereby, of course, with the process we're implementing, taking the revenue charge at the completion certificate stage, that means that immediately we start to gain the full revenues from 2028.
Thank you for that. So if the bringing in of the levy in 2028 isn't going to impact on remediation initially, does that mean that the cost of initial remediation is going to be 100% met from existing taxation streams?
The stage we're going through just now, obviously, is the funding that's been put in place. I think £24 million, but as I said, it's in the Cabinet Secretary for Housing's portfolio responsibility for the assessment works, and then following on from that, as the assessments are completed, the remediation work would start, and that would be funded, as we expect the bulk of this work obviously to be through the Scottish Government's capital programme.
I mean, one of the issues obviously came out from the developers, and obviously we took evidence from two panels, none of whom were particularly enthusiastic. Well, there's one person who supported this levy, others did not. But one of the concerns obviously that was raised was the fact that it's been imposed on developers, some of whom have had absolutely nothing whatsoever to do with cladding, and yet people who were directly involved in cladding, whether it was designers, whether it was architects, whether it was manufacturers, some of whom may or may not be out with this country, of course, are not being expected to pay. So there's a kind of real sense of, I think, bitterness, frankly, among some of these developers, that why should we have to pay for someone else's mistake when the people who actually carried out these mistakes are not being expected to pay anything? You know, that's a real major issue, I think, with this levy.
Well, I think the reality of where we are is that this funding either has to come from the government's capital budget, and the bulk of it will do that, or a proportion, a relatively small proportion, would come from the industry. So we're taking the same approach has been taken down south in this regard. We think that's a proportionate response. There is obviously scope for developers to be able, where they're dealing with responsibility for identified buildings they were involved in, to be able to take measures to address that by pursuing further up the supply chain. And I think it's true to say that we've extended the period within which they're able to do that and able to support that. But as you identified, the complexity of that is such that the option that's open to us, and I think it's the right option to take, is to levy this charge on the developers for some of this cost.
I mean, ultimately, though, this levy will be paid by house buyers, won't it? I mean, so if there are 10,000 houses in a year, for example, which qualify under this, then effectively it's going to just put house prices up by £3,000 because developers aren't going to take out their own profits. They're going to pass it on to house buyers.
Well, clearly it's a competitive market with a lot of different pressures on it, and it will depend on obviously the situation for any given developer in the market. Price is obviously something that's set by a whole range of factors. So it may well be that there's a mixture there, but of course in terms of how much of it developers absorb from their profits and how much of it's passed on, but that of course would vary very much depending on the developer and the circumstances.
And I mean, how tied is the government to this figure of 30 million a year? So, for example, is there going to be flexibility in the size of the levy? So if there's only 7,500 built a year, does that mean the levy might be £4,000? Or if there's only 7,500 built, will it be stuck at 3,000 or whatever it happens to be? So you would only then get 22.5 million. So where are we in the flexibility in terms of...
First of all, it's important to recognise that if the money doesn't come from, and we all recognise this work needs to be done, if it doesn't come from developers, then it would need to come from the capital budget, which would come from Scottish Government General Taxation, which is clearly the only other alternative, or we spend less on other public services. In terms of where the number came from, that is the number that we would have received had we had a consequential share of the amount of money that the UK government is raising through their levy. So that's where the number came from. There is obviously scope in terms of the specifics of the charge that's levied on an annual basis within secondary legislation for ministers to decide the size of that fee of the levy as we put it in place on an annual basis. So there is clearly scope for future ministers to look at that and make decisions on how much they would want to raise from the levy. But as I say, the policy intent at this stage is to reflect the equivalent of what's been raised by, intended to be raised by the UK levy in England.
I mean, the definition includes purpose-built student halls of residence, but there's an intention to exclude from this levy hotels, personal care, hospitals, hospices, prisons, residential accommodation for school pupils, affordable housing, etc. What we've got, though, from the developers is a whole range of other caveats that they're hoping the Scottish Government will look at. So, for example, some have said, it shouldn't apply to less than 50 units. I mean, I find that... I can imagine what the impact would be in the collection levy if that was brought in. But others are saying it should be, rural areas such as Noidat, for example, shouldn't be included. There's a whole load of different caveats. So how open is the Scottish Government to looking at these caveats? Because what they've said is that this levy will be a disincentive in some sites, which will mean fewer built houses will be built, which will obviously impact on housing supply. But if there's 4 people on average employed to build a house and they're not employed building that house because of the impact of this levy, then they're not going to be paying taxes, and it will have a wider impact on Scottish taxation. So the unintended consequences, the developers say, could be significant. So I'm just wondering what the Scottish Government's been doing to try and look at that and to see what the elasticity is in this regard.
First of all, in terms of in terms of the housing market, we're very conscious, and we meet regularly, myself and the Housing Cabinet Secretary, with Homes for Scotland, with developers and others in the sector, to understand their issues and concerns, because we recognise to tackle the housing emergency, everyone needs to play their part. So we're very conscious of the feedback from developers in this regard. To reflect back on the point that this fund has to be raised from somewhere, and if it wasn't raised from the developers through this mechanism, it would have to come from other parts of the government's expenditure, capital expenditure, which of course would have a detrimental impact on economic growth if we sort of other capital programmes or public services or taxation, which again could have an impact on economic growth. So whichever way you look at this, there are potential impacts. In terms of the exemptions, I think, yeah, you can make a case for a lot of different exemptions. We've tried to work this through in a way that reflects the government's priorities round about affordable housing, round about some of the other uses that you've mentioned, refuges, etc. And very much the islands exemption, which takes into account also the parts of the country that are generally only reachable by boat, which is the definition that's used for those remote areas, and also the approach we're taking to a threshold on the levy in terms of the allowance that each developer would get, which clearly will disproportionately significantly support smaller and medium-sized developers, and we would expect would disproportionately support rural communities where it's more likely that smaller developers would be building in those communities. And impact assessments have been done for the bill.
I suppose we're on Laffercurve territory to some degree, because what they're basically saying is that this could have a bigger impact in terms of the overall income of the Scottish Government if it reduces the taxation that comes from other areas through unintended consequences. So, for example, Miller Homes have said that a few years ago they built a quarter of their houses in Scotland. Now it's only 14% because they feel the regulatory burden here is already too high relative to other parts of the UK, notwithstanding legislation that's been passed in England. So, what would you say to people like that who feel that they are having to pay yet more when they're already paying, somewhere in the region of 25,000 plus tax per new house?
I think what I would say is that we're conscious of the concerns that they have. We engage extensively with the sector on all these measures, and as you rightly identified, the building safety levy obviously has been applied right across the UK, so I don't think that would be a reason why they would disproportionately choose to build less in Scotland compared to the rest of the UK, where it's also been implemented.
Now, obviously affordable housing, a lot of developments have affordable housing as part of the component. So if there's any reduction in the amount of private housing, what impact will that have on delivery of affordable housing?
Well, you're right. There's well, first of all, of course, affordable housing is exempt from the levy, so that's and you're correct. All of this has to be considered in the round as part of the discussions that we have with the sector and others about the need to support house building. But I'll take you back to the point: if the sector wasn't making this relatively small contribution to the overall costs, then those funds would have to be raised elsewhere.
Okay. I mean, I see there's a theme here, but in terms of brownfield sites, for example, they've said they cost particularly more because of remediation, and they're looking again at some kind of relief on that. But of course, if we're talking about 30 million coming in, and we have reliefs, and we exclude, sites of this size or that size or rural or whatever, then the actual net in which you can actually catch people becomes smaller, and therefore the fee either has to go up or you collect less. So where are you in terms of discussions on that particular issue with regard to urban brownfield sites?
No, we're very conscious of brownfield, and I think we've indicated that there would be relief for brownfield. We just need to work through the details of the extent of that. In England, it's a 50% reduction, so they pay half on brownfield. In Scotland, we are very conscious of the need because of those additional remedial costs and because of the location of those sites very often in town and city centres where we would want to encourage development.
Will that not mean that greenfield sites are impacted more if you try to collect the same amount of money?
That is absolutely correct, yeah. And this is obviously a balance in terms of how you pursue those policy objectives and balancing that against the cost to those that aren't covered by the reliefs.
Okay, thanks very much. I'm going to open out the session to colleagues around the table. First will be Michael, to be followed by Craig.
Good afternoon, Minister. The use of polluter pays as a principle on this. Do you think this is a polluter pays tax?
Well, I think it's important to recognise that the asking the sector to pay for this is important, and that is the measure that has been taken forward by both Conservative and Labour government south of the border, so it's absolutely no different in that regard to what's happening elsewhere in the UK.
Tax will be paid by people who have never used these materials or built any of the buildings.
I do recognise that may be the case in some situations. It's, again, as I say, it's exactly the same basis that's been taken forward in the rest of the UK, and if the fund wasn't being raised there, it would be have to be raised either through taxation or less investment in public services, and the impact there clearly would be felt by people who also had no direct involvement in creating the situation we find ourselves with these buildings.
And do you think that it's a lack of capital that is resulting in such slow progress in Scotland on dealing with remediation? So we've had, since in Q2 of 2025, there's only 3 single building assessments that have been completed, whereas in the rest of the UK and England, 2,490 buildings have either started or completed the actual work. So is it the availability of the money that is the issue, or is there another reason that our performance in dealing with this crucial safety issue in Scotland is so dramatically worse than the rest of the UK?
So as I said, obviously my colleague Mary McCallan's taking this work forward, and I'll perhaps ask officials to comment in more detail on some of this because they're closer to the detail. But there are fundamental differences in the market in Scotland. Round about, for example, the ownership structure of these buildings, which clearly will have, because of their nature, many occupants in them. In Scotland, that would obviously be a freehold in a situation where you've got many freeholders, whereas in England it would typically be a leasehold environment, so finding the single owner of the building, the freeholder of the building, is much easier. In Scotland it's much more complicated in that regard. There was also a gap in the legislation to enable ministers to engage in this process, so that legislation had to be put in place even to get us to the stage where we could engage with building owners or occupants, and then there are, in terms of then how you marshal that to take forward the delivery of the remediation, because again you're in that freehold environment, multiple freeholders compared to a leasehold environment. It does make for much more complication.
So on that basis, it's not the availability of capital in the short run that's been the problem.
You're
setting out a series of very reasonable other issues, but it's not the availability of capital that's been the issue.
And funds indeed have been put in, as I said, to support the evaluation work to assess the extent of remediation that will be required.
Okay, and so you don't anticipate that the advent of these funds is going to significantly accelerate this work?
No, as I said, the funds that are raised from this is as the convener said, a relatively small proportion of the total funds. The bulk of the lifting on this will be done by the Scottish Government's capital budget.
Less than 2%, 1.76% of the overall cost is £30 million. I know it's £30 million per annum, but of the 1.7 billion that you identified.
Yeah, well, if you take that over the lifetime, with 12 to 15 years, you're talking 20+%, but it's in that range. Take the number you've got and multiply by 12 or 15, you end up in the 20 to 25% range. So that of the total picture. So that is that is the total cost environment, as I say. So the Scottish Government funding for the remediation as it gets identified and required to be done will be a balance, and that balance will obviously change over time.
I think given the evidence we've had so far from the industry and stakeholders, I'm sure that the delay will be welcome that you've announced today. But is that just an arbitrary date that you've picked? So, for instance, in the legislation in England, there is an 18-month window by which there has to be clarity on the rates and set and for the commencement of that tax to allow for investment planning. Would it not be better to have that kind of window in our legislation rather than a 2028 start date? Or are you confident that by the middle of 2026 you'll have had all the secondary legislation passed, all the details in place, particularly given that we have an election in that period? It feels to me to still be quite ambitious.
Well, it gives that 22-month period, which is important. It's set at that April 2028 date because it's the start of the new financial year. You could pick another date. You could do what you suggest. I think this gives some clarity that we know when the date will be. And as we've committed to taking forward the secondary legislation, which we believe is perfectly doable, that this bill goes through stage 3 prior to the end of March. Then we're in a position to when the new government comes back after the election, for them to make decisions on those rates and to publish those.
We'll have clarity on the date, but not a trigger for that date, in essence of having the information set that the sector is looking for. So how much is this going to cost them?
Yeah.
How's it going to operate? And then deciding where that is. So at the moment, you're just setting the end point rather than the trigger for when that starts. Yeah. It still feels to me that if you're looking at the short period that we have, not just in this committee, but you're confident that you think you can get all of this done, and then secondary legislation after May but before the summer recess? Is that the idea?
That's the intention, yeah.
That's the intention. Okay.
Sorry.
I'm not sure we're planning on completing secondary legislation in 2026.
But, so just to be clear, we'll be in a position to be able to give that 22-month notice to developers in terms of the rates and reliefs, but not necessarily all the secondary legislation. Just a point of legal clarification, not all of the secondary legislation, but the parts in relation to the reliefs and the rate of the levy.
Okay, the intention is that the rates will be given indicatively.
Indicative rates. Sorry.
Getting that into the microphone.
Yeah.
I'm not sure. I realise you're giving the Minister advice on the hoof, but it would be good to hear it as well.
Yes, the timetable for secondary legislation is not yet confirmed. It is unlikely it will be completed in 2026, but the rate of tax for 2028, 1st April 28, will be given indicatively after the election.
Which is the same process, I believe, that they've taken down south, where they've given indicative rates 18 months ahead. Yeah.
Okay. Okay, that's very useful.
Thanks.
Okay. I'll leave it there at the moment. Kabir.
Okay, thank you very much. Craig, to be followed by Michelle.
Good morning, Mr McKee. At the heart of this is effectively public safety, people's lives in buildings that are present unsafe, and also people's livelihoods, because people who presently cannot sell their property would find it very difficult to sell their property because of the cloud that's hanging over them. The UK government has said that by 2029, 95% of buildings taller than 11 metres will have been remediated, or a date for completion will have been set. What is the Scottish Government's target in respect of that?
Again, it's outside my portfolio, but I'll defer to officials who will give some background on that.
Yeah, so in the Cabinet Secretary for Housing's updated plan of action that was published in August this year, she set a target date for the remediation of 18-metre plus high-rise, high-risk buildings by the end of 2029 to galvanise the activity across the sector, and also that all other buildings that have been assessed and require further mitigations or remediation works will have a date for completion at that point.
So, Minister, do you anticipate this one-year delay for the introduction of the levy to have an impact on the ability of the industry to meet this target?
As indicated earlier, no.
No, okay, fine. In relation to the funds that the Scottish Government has already received for remediation, in 2021 you received £95 million from the £1 billion Building Safety Fund. What has that money been spent on?
Well, all of that money will eventually be spent on remediation of buildings, but the issue, of course, is that we need to go through that legal process, identify who the owners were. We had to put the legal powers in place to do that. We then have to go through the call for the buildings to be brought forward. We then need to go through the assessment process, which has been funded before we can start the remedial works. It started, obviously, on a very small number of buildings. But
you would see that in year that money was spent, and you'll have to then use future revenues in order to make up for that.
Yeah, and if we'd sat here with an underspend, I'm sure you would have had something to say about that as well.
Fine. In respect of the exemptions, obviously, the greater the number of exemptions, or the wider the scope of exemptions, the less the levy is going to bring in. But we've heard from several stakeholders that, given that there is an acute rural housing crisis, that to exempt one part of rural Scotland, i.e. the islands or hard-to-reach geographical territories, doesn't take account of the fact that this could have significant consequences in other rural areas. Now, you said that the lower thresholds will be one issue, but wouldn't it just be far simpler to identify a definition of rural Scotland and to exempt that entirely?
Well, I think it's fair to say that the housing issues affect all local authorities across the country, urban as well, and clearly there are significant challenges in our cities. I don't think anybody would deny that. And I think to get into try to define what we mean by what is rural, what is semi-rural, what is small town, what is large town, what is city, what is suburban, what is... We can end up in quite a complicated space. So I think we've stuck clearly to those definitions around about rural and remote that are already in place. And we have, as I said, I believe that through the application of those thresholds, that will significantly disproportionately beneficially support rural areas in that regard as well.
Last week, Scottish Land and Estates did put forward what they thought would be quite a good working model for a definition of rural Scotland. So would the government be prepared to look again at that exemption, just to give clarity and surety to areas where I think there is an acute housing problem?
I think we're happy to look at that, bearing in mind the point that's been made already, that the more exemptions you put in, the more the impact falls elsewhere. But I'm perfectly happy to look at that.
Why do you think the majority of property developers and construction companies that have come before us are so opposed to the levy, not just the principle, but also the practicality of the bill as it currently sets out the levy proposition?
So you're asking me why organisations that may have to pay more tax are opposed to having to pay that tax?
Well, it's not just the concept. I think they're saying that the practicality of it is significant, but also I think Mr Mara referred to the principle as well, which is some of these construction operators have had no interface with cladding at all, and they basically are saying that they're having to pay for the sins of others within the industry. Would you accept that that is a flaw in the design of this?
Well, I think it's the reality of where we are, right? There's a significant proportion of these buildings there isn't an identified developer. That has to be, as you've identified yourself, public safety reasons, addressed. There is a choice about whether all of this was carried by public finances or whether only the significant majority of it was carried by public finances, and we asked the sector to contribute towards these costs. We've taken this approach, which is the same approach as the rest of the UK. We are seeking to work on the detail of this and engage with the sector very extensively to understand where there are areas. I believe that what I've announced today and other steps we've taken in reliefs and the mechanisms for this, I think, are more helpful for developers. The fact that in Scotland it's Revenue Scotland that's doing all of this and not 296 different local authorities collecting it. The fact we'll have one rate in Scotland compared to almost 600 in England, I think makes it easier for developers. The fact we're doing it and the completion certificate rather than at the building control stage, which significantly helps developers cash flow because they're only paying much closer to the point where they themselves get paid. So I think we're working hard to see what we can be done to, with the sector, make the processes as supportive as it can be, given the fact that we're asking people for money.
The developer community is saying there's one section of the industry that's effectively getting away scot-free are construction product manufacturers and companies that have produced cladding. Now, I recognise many of them will have probably disappeared from the scene in the last 8 years, but what consideration has the Scottish Government given to extending the scope, potentially, of the levy to include those who manufacture these products?
I think from a practical point of view, we talk about practical challenge, I think that would be extremely challenging. Officials might want to comment on this. They've been closer to the detail and investigating that, but I think it would be extremely challenging. We came to the same conclusion as the UK government did on that. For many regions you've identified, a lot of them won't be around, a lot of them will be international, a lot of them it would be hard to identify what was the situation in terms of their involvement. But as I say, there is that provision. We've extended the time period, I think up to 15 years, to enable developers to be able to pursue supply chain companies in that regard. But I don't know if we want to say any more on that.
I could just add that the power that was devolved by the UK government allows us to place tax on the building standards process only. So extending the building safety levy as is out to include any product manufacturers, I think, would be very technically difficult.
Okay, that's helpful to hear. One of the other concerns of the industry is that basically there is no sunset clause within this legislation. We've had evidence from the architects and from the fire brigade that basically that they have said they have concerns that there is always in any 10 to 15 year window another scandal coming along, and they've identified a couple of potential areas where we should have cause for concern. To what extent should the developer community now just be assuming that this is a tax that's here to stay, or would you support their cause for this to be a hard stop to be put in at a certain point, be that 10 or 15 years from now?
Well, I think it's important to say that we all agree that the remediation has to be carried out. The full scale of that we won't obviously know until the assessments are done. So at this stage we wouldn't be able to put a final end on that, but clearly we're working to an assessment at this stage based on best available information, which obviously is broadly in line with the assessment that's been made south of the border in terms of being able to predict future challenges of technical nature in building construction. I think that's probably outside the powers of Scottish Government ministers. There may be such challenges in the future, and that would of course be for future governments to deal with that, or there might not be.
To a sunset clause being inserted into the legislation?
I think again that's something that we can consider. I think that clearly a sunset clause in any event, if a future government, future parliament decided that it was to be repealed in any event, would have the capability to do that. But at the moment we haven't put that in, and I don't think it's the case down south that they've got a sunset clause either.
No, it's not.
No, it's not. Okay, but there are clearly still, until we get through this phase of the assessment, there are a lot of unknowns. So even where you would put that, I think, is, and even the data we put forward today, it's between a 12 to 15 year outcome. So it's hard to pin that down exactly at this stage.
Right, okay, thank you.
Michelle, to follow by John.
Good morning, Minister. Just a few wee questions. The Royal Incorporation of Architects had made commentary about what they called quasi-hypothecation of this, which they subsequently wrote to the committee and said that they thought that the legal basis was fairly weak in explaining what they meant by quasi-hypothecation. In other words, they'd like to see it screwed down a lot more firmly, that the intention, not just a policy intention, but legally the monies raised from this levy must be spent on mediating cladding rather than for any other purposes. Is that something you'd be willing to consider?
Oh, clearly, I mean, in terms of how government budgets run, and we have this conversation at other times in terms of making sure that we use all the money that's available to us to meet the priorities of the people of Scotland. I think the idea you'd put that money in a biscuit tin and keep it there for is not the way that the finances work, clearly. Now, if you look at this in a macro level, then when it's clearly understood that the total cost of the remediation is going to be far, far higher than the amount of money that's raised through the levy. So I think there's absolutely no doubt that everything that is raised in the levy will find its way towards remediation just by the virtue of that fact alone. So I think that the mechanism by which you would do that hypothecation doesn't seem practical or necessary.
Okay. In terms of build to rent, one of the areas that's not been considered, I appreciate that the active consideration has been made for developers that they've got money in so they can pay the tax, but build to rent is obviously a slightly different model. What further consideration has been given for build to rent specifically? Because obviously that's an important pathway forward to get to the number of housing completions we need.
Oh yeah, I think if you excluded build to rent, you'd be in a position where you'd be putting more load onto other bits of the sector. And the model there, you're right, it's a rental revenue model, but the calculation in terms of the capital outlay for the construction cost is obviously a significant outlay, and that's factored into the business model that the investors would take forward. So it's another piece of that calculation they need to take on board. But I think their model will be well set up to be able to deal with that.
Okay, and I mean, somewhere in the multitude of evidence we've got, there was a kind of claim from the Scottish Government that basically, well, we have to do this and no other solutions were offered. But we had commentary, I think, from Homes in Scotland, for Scotland last week that, well, they hadn't been asked to come up with any other solutions. So they felt slightly irked that they were saying no other solutions were proffered when they hadn't been asked. I take it's too late in the day to ask for any other solutions, that you're completely wedded to this?
I'm always interested in talking to people about solutions.
Okay. Okay, I'm sure they'll be pleased to know that. One of the things we talked about, and I know the convener touched on this, and we also had a discussion with Revenue Scotland this morning, was mitigating against kind of, or putting in place good behaviour in terms of compliance for special purpose vehicles, because most building firms will use them as a matter of course. And through the course of the discussion, it's become increasingly clear that, well, we won't have the detail via secondary legislation till some way down the line, which reminds me of the kind of old war horse that this committee's gone on about quite a lot, where we're using this framework legislation to come up with some principles, but the devil of the detail won't be around for quite some time, and probably even potentially after you've set a rate, as was being probed. So just, I can see you looking there, but just to kind of give a bit of clarity there, at the moment, there is a very real possibility that a building firm can set up an SPV and then promptly fold it before they pay the tax. And yes, there's mitigations you can take, but it's long and it's involved and it's complex and it's expensive for Revenue Scotland. So I'm just trying to probe and get your feelings of this approach, because surely we wouldn't do all of this in a perfect world in this way.
Okay, so a few things. I mean, clearly there are, at Scottish Government and the UK Government level, in terms of tax collection measures and mitigations and processes to prevent people running a business, making money, folding a business and running away with the money. Because you're not allowed to do that, right? So likewise, in this regard, yeah, there'll be issues to be worked through, but it's not as if we don't collect tax from companies at a UK level or indeed at a Scottish level already, and there are mechanisms for doing that, and I'm sure Revenue Scotland are going through the technical parts of that with you. I don't know if we want to say any more on that. Is that?
Yeah, just to confirm that we're working with both Revenue Scotland and HMRC to understand the variety of structures that are in play in the property development sector, and to ensure that we can the tax is ultimately applied proportionately and fairly.
I mean, we did have that conversation. Let me just check my list. Yeah, Fiona from Homes for Scotland was making the point that the new build market size has been overstated by about 1.4 billion. And she was also making commentary that we've got estimates of estimates because we're following what's happening down south. And I think the concern really played into what was alluded to earlier, is a lack of not just financial modelling, but it's behavioural modelling, which I think the convener was alluding to with the Laffer curve. Is that something that you want to get some meat in the bones of, to really properly start to model this? I mean, surely you'll have to do that to set the rate. I know what you've said about date, but you'll have to have some understanding the modelling to set the rate.
Yeah, I mean, clearly there's data, robust data, in terms of the number of completions. So that's understood, and the categorisation of that vis-à-vis the exemptions we're talking about. In terms of the total market, I think the difference there, officials can maybe give more detail on that, was the period of time over which the average was taken. So I think we've used a certain number of years to average what we think the size of the market is, and also Scotland's using a different number of years to average, and that's why we're having that difference. But I think the effect of that, if you look at, I think we get this out at 0.6% of the total market size. If you use their numbers, it would be a slightly higher number, but it still would be in that range. It doesn't make a material difference in terms of the size of that percentage of the total cost or the total size of the housing market.
Okay. Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. John, followed by Liz.
Thanks very much, Convener. So we've covered quite a lot of ground already. I mean, the bill actually says building safety, as I understand it, rather than for cladding for the money. Is that an intentional description?
It's the same as the bill down south. So, yeah, it's, I mean,
but it doesn't have to be the same.
It doesn't have to be the same. It could be different. That's what it's called.
Yeah. Because that has flagged up to people the point that's already been raised that we could just keep it going for the next housing crisis or building crisis. Would it reassure people if it was just cladding?
Well, it may do. But as I say, I think we don't have the crystal ball that tells us what may or may not happen with regard to building safety issues in the future, and clearly it would be up to future governments and future parliaments to take a view on that. Sorry, do you want to?
You don't need to press the button.
Sorry. I was just going to say that sorry, never mind.
The suggestions we made as to why we're going for square metres, the footprint of the building rather than the value, and on the surface, I mean, I would think if somebody's got a bigger house, they can afford to pay a bit more than somebody with or somebody a more valuable house, say, than somebody who's even the house might be the same size, but it's not so expensive.
I think it comes back to the ease of use, because those are numbers that are well known through the building process right from the planning stage. The architects and developers will know what those numbers are, so it means that they can plan on that basis. Whereas the end price is a number that may be moving about right up to the last minute, depending on a range of factors. So it's harder for them to assess what the levy would be for them to be able to factor that in. So it did seem the most robust and straightforward methodology for doing it. I take the point you're making about different types of houses and so on and so forth, but clearly what we're doing through reliefs on the affordability element of that, I think, goes a long way to addressing that.
So if one huge house is built on its own, it would be subject to the levy. There's no bottom limit to the number of buildings that have to be in a development.
No, unlike the system in England, where they are defining it based on the size of the development, what we've done in Scotland is we've given each developer an allocation that they can build levy-free. So what that means is that for small house builders, it's quite possible that they might not build their quota, and so all of the majority of what they build is levy-free.
That's still to be decided exactly what the value or numbers or whatever.
Exactly what the number is.
Have to be.
Yeah.
Right. So I suppose on that point of view, I mean, if we're trying to raise £30 million, and if perhaps there's fewer houses in Scotland, does that mean the rate in Scotland might be quite a lot higher than the rate down south?
Well, the numbers all start from the same place, which our £30 million comes from our pro rata share of the amount that the UK government is intending to raise from the levy, and everything is a twelfth of the size. So, in that regard, it would flow through as the same numbers. Now, clearly, there'll be different characteristics around the shape of the housing market in Scotland, but obviously the housing market in England is very, very varied as well, depending on where you are and what part of England you're in. Clearly the shape of what the exemptions and reliefs look like in Scotland could be different round the margins from what there is in England. So there could be some differences there. But again, as I say, the rates in England, because they've got 200 or whatever it's 580 odd different rates in England, that's quite a wide range within that. So yeah, the Scottish numbers will fall within that range somewhere.
And how many different rates might we have then? One?
Well, maybe two if we're doing something on brownfield, yeah. Or
right.
Effectively. Sorry, do you want to?
Sorry. So the rate setting will happen, as the Minister said earlier, in June 2026, and decisions are yet to be taken on the areas to which the rates will apply. So it's currently unclear exactly how many rates will exist in Scotland, but I think we're unlikely to hit 600.
So a lot simpler than England, but maybe
Yes.
more.
I think again that perhaps come back to reflect some of the points you're making as we go through that rate setting process to understand some of the variances that there are.
Yeah. Okay, that's quite good to clarify that. Because, I mean, if, as has been claimed, a lot more of our proportion of our housing is affordable housing and it's not going to have anything, then it would imply that the remaining housing is proportionately less and would need a higher rate. But I take your point, there's so many rates in England, it's difficult to compare.
Yeah, and I maybe want to reflect on the fact on the record that if there is significant more affordable housing in Scotland, that's perhaps not a bad thing.
Absolutely a good thing, you know, that just obviously has a knock-on effect. I mean, we've mentioned different places or types of houses that might be excluded. Why are hotels excluded? I mean, it seems to me that you pay so much in Edinburgh already that another few pounds wouldn't hurt the people.
I think that I mean, it's a different type of use, obviously, and it's a very, very small percentage in the big scheme of things. But I don't know if officials want to comment on any of the other criteria that apply there.
So hotels are sort of distinctly different from the long-term accommodation that the levy is looking to charge. Now, there are instances where hotels are used as accommodation or as residences, for example, emergency accommodation, but these are exceptional cases and they're not considered the primary use for hotels. So that's why they're sitting outside of the scope at the moment. And as the Minister says, there's very few new hotels constructed in Scotland, so it doesn't have a material impact on the tax base.
There are quite a lot of hotels, and some of them are quite tall, so they would have some kind of cladding on them. And I mean, surely it doesn't make a difference if it's one person lives in the flat for 365 days or 365 people live in a hotel room. I mean, it's exactly the same thing.
Yeah. Okay. I hear I mean, all of these are judgment calls, to be honest.
Okay.
We've gone through this and looked at the...
Well, it's just everybody else is trying to let you have more exemptions, so I'm suggesting
you unexempt some things.
Exactly.
Very admirable, Mr Mason.
Thank you. Trying to be helpful. The DPLR committee raised a point about you were getting the power to modify any enactments which would include this bill. What's your kind of response to their concerns around that?
Of you? Sorry. Yeah, please join you. Yeah.
I think this is simply following the pattern of the other recent tax legislation where it may be necessary to amend other enactments. For instance, in connection with this bill, it may be necessary to amend technical provisions of the building standards regulations in order to ensure the correct data is captured in applications for building completion certificates. But it is simply following the pattern of other legislation.
Both that committee and Parliament, you know, is worried if the government gets it's too wide. Do you think could it be narrowed down, or is it really where you feel it needs to be?
This is where ministers feel it needs to be.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Convener.
You mentioned your turn.
Like including tents. Well, I'm not sure. Let's.
Yes, just one question, Minister. Notwithstanding the fact that nobody likes paying extra tax, whether it's a new tax or an old tax, are you in any way concerned about the criticism, the level of criticism about this tax amongst stakeholders?
We always listen closely to what the sector has to say. We understand the cumulative impact of charges, of course we do. We recognise that the sector has a crucial role to play in helping us work together to resolve the housing challenges that we face, and we'll continue to work with the sector on this. So I think, obviously, in a perfect world, we wouldn't want to be doing this, but we need to do it.
I think it's very important to this committee, Minister, because there has been substantial concern about the potential, perhaps unintended consequences, but there are a lot of concerns, and it would be good to have assurance on the record that the Scottish Government is listening to that concern and is prepared to make some amendments.
No, absolutely listening. Very keen to engage further, and as I've said several times, clearly the fact that this has been done in the rest of the UK is an important factor in our considerations here. But yeah, we continue to engage extensively with the sector on this.
Okay, thank you.
Included questions from the committee. Any further points you want to make, Minister, before we wind up?
No, just thank you very much.
I'd like to thank you and indeed your team of officials this morning. That was our last evidence session in the Building Safety Levy Scotland Bill. The committee will report on its findings next month, as that was the final item on our agenda. And I close this meeting. Thanks to all for their participation.